Wesley Danner didn't ask permission. He never did. He threw open the corral gate so hard the wood cracked against the post, grabbed the lead rope off the fence rail, and walked straight at Midnight Crown, like the animal owed him something. The stallion's ears went flat. His nostrils flared wide. Every hand on Red Willow Ranch took one step back without being told to. Been babied long enough, Wesley said, loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough to make sure Rourke Maddox heard it too. A horse learns who's in charge or he doesn't learn anything. He snapped the rope hard across the stallion's flank. Midnight Crown exploded. If this kind of story moves you the kind where a woman finally stops watching her life from the other side of a fence, and a man has to decide whether he's brave enough to stay, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss a single part of this story. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Rourke Maddox had been on the road for 11 days when Red Willow Ranch finally came into view, and the first thing he noticed wasn't the land. The land was fine. Better than fine, actually. The eastern pastures rolled out wide and unhurried, the kind of country that didn't apologize for itself. Grass still holding some green despite the dry summer. Fencing that someone had bothered to keep upright. A creek line threading silver through the far tree break. Rourke had worked at ranches from Montana down through Texas and back again, and he had a quick eye for what a place said about the people running it. Red Willow said, "We take this seriously. We have for a long time." But it wasn't the land that stopped him at the top of the rise. It was the woman at the corral. She was standing at the fence with her arms folded over the top rail, watching something inside the corral with the kind of focused quiet that most people reserved for things they'd been studying a long time. She wasn't beautiful the way a man noticed immediately from a distance and then forgot up close. She was the opposite of that. From where Rourke sat on his horse, she was simply a woman at a fence, still and unhurried, her chestnut hair pulled back loosely, one boot resting on the lowest rail. It was only as he rode closer that things started filling in the line of her jaw, the steadiness of her posture, the way her eyes tracked whatever was moving inside that corral with a precision that had nothing casual about it. He pulled up 20 yards out and looked where she was looking. Midnight Crown. The stallion was pacing the far edge of the corral in that tight, contained way that meant the animal wasn't calm, was never calm, had probably forgotten what calm felt like. 16 hands of black horse with a neck like a forge hammer and 4 white socks that flashed every time he turned. Even pacing, even nervous, he was something to see. Rourke understood immediately why the letter had said what it said. This wasn't a difficult horse. This was a horse that had been made into a problem by someone who didn't know the difference. He dismounted at the hitching post, looped his reins, and walked toward the fence. The woman didn't look at him. She said, without turning, "You're the Horsebreaker." It wasn't a question. "Rourke Maddox," he said. "Maren Harrow." She still didn't look at him. Her eyes were on the stallion. He favors his right hindquarter. Don't approach from that side until he tells you it's all right. Rourke stopped a few feet away and watched the horse. "Who told you that?" "He did." He almost smiled. He didn't. "How long has he been like this?" 8 weeks. Since 2 of our hands tried to shoe him, using a twitch and a war bridle at the same time. She said it flat, without drama. Like she was reading from a ledger. He went over backward. Took the fence rail with him. Took most of the skins off his hock on the right side. "Your father know you're telling me this?" For the first time, she turned and looked at him. Her eyes were hazel, somewhere between green and brown, depending on the light, and they held the particular expression of a person who has explained a thing too many times to too many people who didn't listen. "My father told you to use whatever methods you need to get the horse rideable. He didn't say anything about what I do or don't tell you." "Fair enough. The 2 men who tried to ride him after that." She turned back to the horse. One still walking with a cane. The other one quit ranching entirely. "I read the letter. The letter didn't mention the right hindquarter." He looked at her. "No, it didn't." She unfolded her arms from the rail, straightened up, and gave the stallion one last look, something almost private in it, almost apologetic. Then she walked away toward the main house without saying anything else. Rourke stood at the fence for a long time after that, watching Midnight Crown pace, thinking about what the woman had just told him in 45 seconds, that the letter, written by a man who owned the horse, hadn't bothered to include. Gideon Harrow was a big man running to heaviness in his 60s, with a white beard trimmed close and the kind of handshake that still meant something to him. He met Rourke on the porch, offered coffee before business, which Rourke took as a good sign, and then spread his hands across the table, like he was laying out a problem he'd been sitting with too long. "I'm not a man who asks for help easily," Gideon said. "Most men who own land aren't. I've had 3 men try that horse. 3 good men." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I paid the doctor bill for 2 of them and the traveling money for 1. I don't mind telling you that Stallion has cost me more than I care to count." "What do you want done with him?" Gideon looked up. "I want him rideable. I want him sound. I paid a considerable sum for that animal, and I have reason to believe, when he was younger, before whatever happened to him before I got him." He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I want the horse I paid for. That's what I want. Your daughter told me about the incident with the shoeing." Something moved across Gideon's face. Not quite irritation. Something more complicated. "Maren has opinions about the horse. She was right about the right hindquarter. I could see it from 20 feet away once I knew to look." "She's a good girl," Gideon said, which wasn't a response to what Rourke had said at all. "She's always had a feel for animals. Her mother was the same way." He set down his cup. "I'd like you to work with my foreman, Cleet, on the day-to-day. He'll get you what you need." Rourke nodded, and Maddox Gideon held his eyes. "I've heard you're the best at what you do. I'm prepared to pay for the best. But I need results. The Army Remount Office is coming through this territory in 2 months. Midnight Crown is the kind of animal they'd pay very well for. That's my deadline." 2 months is enough time," Rourke said, "if the horse cooperates." "And if he doesn't?" Rourke stood up. "Then we figure out what's stopping him." The bunkhouse was clean, which Rourke appreciated. He'd slept in worse places than a man should have to, and a clean bunkhouse told you something about a foreman worth knowing. Cleet Drummond was a short, wire-lean man in his 50s with a mustache that had gone fully gray and eyes that moved fast and filed things away. He showed Rourke his bunk, the tack room, the grain situation, and the water schedule with an efficiency that said he'd done this before. Oriented men who came through temporarily and didn't waste words doing it. "Midnight Crown gets fed last," Cleet said. "Morning and evening. Not because anyone's punishing him. Just because he settles better when the other horses are already settled." "Good thinking." "Wasn't my thinking." Cleet's expression didn't change. "Miss Maren noticed it about a month ago. I figured she was right, so I did it." Rourke looked at him. "How often is she right?" Cleet was quiet for a moment. "More than anyone around here gives her credit for." He said it without any particular heat, just as a fact he'd observed and filed away somewhere. That night, Rourke lay on his bunk and listened to the ranch settle into quiet, the horses shifting, the distant creak, the wind moving through the cottonwoods, and thought about what he'd walked into. He'd come for a horse. He'd come because the money was good, and because the horse sounded like exactly the kind of problem he was built to solve. He hadn't come for anything else. He was 37 years old, and he'd been moving since he was 22, and he had gotten very good at arriving at a place, doing what he came to do, and leaving again, without leaving anything of himself behind. He was good at that. He was very good at it. He fell asleep thinking about a woman at a fence who hadn't turned to look at him when she knew he was there. The first morning, Rourke went to the corral at sunup and did nothing. He stood outside the fence. He watched the horse. The horse watched him back with the whites of his eyes showing, and his whole body coiled like a question waiting to become a disaster. Rourke didn't move toward the gate. He didn't approach. He just stood there with his coffee, going cold in his hand, and let the horse look at him. After 40 minutes, Midnight Crown went back to pacing. Progress. The second morning, same thing. He moved 6 feet closer to the gate. The horse noticed. The coiling got tighter for a while, then gradually the animal went back to something that wasn't quite relaxed, but wasn't maximum alarm either. The ranch hands noticed by the third morning. Rourke could hear them talking. Not to him, not anywhere near him, but in the easy way that men talked around a bunkhouse when they thought they were out of earshot. 3 mornings just standing there. Fellas getting paid well to stand and watch a horse. Maybe that's the trick. Get paid to do nothing and call it a method. Rourke heard all of it. He didn't respond to any of it. He'd been doing this long enough to know that the men who talked the loudest in the first week were usually the ones who came around the quietest in the last one. On the 4th morning, Maren appeared at the fence. She came from the house side, walked to the rail, and stood about 15 feet down from him without looking at him first. Just like that first day. Looking at the horse, Rourke waited to see if she'd speak first. She did. His left ear, she said, goes slightly flatter than his right when he's about to panic. Just before. Most people see the feet moving and think that's the warning. The ear's the real warning. Rourke looked at the stallion. Watched the ears. How long did it take you to notice that? About a week. After the incident, who'd you tell? She was quiet a moment. My father. He said I should let the professionals handle it. Rourke watched the horse. Left ear, he said, mostly to himself, filing it. Yes. He looked sideways at her. Thank you. She shrugged one shoulder barely. Like it cost her something small to accept it. After that, she came every morning. Not always for long. Sometimes she'd stand there for 5 minutes and walk away. Sometimes she'd stay for an hour. She didn't always talk. When she did, it was always about the horse, something she'd noticed. Some change in his behavior. Some pattern she'd tracked over the weeks before Rourke arrived. It was the most useful information he got from anyone on the ranch, delivered in the fewest possible words, with no apparent interest in being thanked for it. On the 7th day, Rourke opened the corral gate and walked in. Empty hands, no rope, no halter, nothing. He heard one of the hands actually say the words, "He's going to get killed," from somewhere behind him, and he had to work to keep the smile off his face because he'd heard some version of that sentence in almost every corral he'd ever entered. Midnight Crown went to the far corner and put his hindquarters against the fence rail. His ears said everything his body language was still figuring out how to say. He was terrified. Genuinely, deeply terrified in a way that had been built into him by someone, or several someones, over time. Rourke stopped in the middle of the corral and crouched down. He sat there for a long time. It was an old thing he'd learned from an old man in Wyoming who'd learned it from someone before him. Make yourself smaller, slower, less threatening than the animal expects, and let the animal decide what happens next. Most men hated it. Most men wanted to be in charge of what happened next. That need to be in charge was exactly what made them dangerous around a frightened horse. After 20 minutes, Midnight Crown's ears moved. Just slightly. Just once. But they moved forward, not flat. Rourke stood up slowly and walked out of the corral. When he latched the gate behind him, Maren was at the fence. She'd been watching the whole time. He looked at you when you stood up, she said. I know. That's the first time he's looked directly at a person and not been in full panic. I know that too. She studied him for a moment with those hazel eyes. Most men would have roped him on the first day. Most men would have a crippled horse on the second day. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something. It was that evening that Rourke first encountered Wesley Danner, and he understood within approximately 30 seconds what kind of man he was dealing with. Wesley arrived in a good buggy pulled by a matched pair, which told you he wanted to be noticed arriving. He was perhaps 28, broad-shouldered, with the settled confidence of a man who'd grown up understanding that his family name opened doors before he'd said a word. He shook hands with Gideon on the porch. He took off his hat to Maren in a way that managed to be appreciative and proprietary at the same time. He barely glanced at Rourke. Heard you got someone in to work the black horse, Wesley said to Gideon, nodding toward the corral. Rourke Maddox, best in the territory. Wesley looked at the corral. My father broke 3 stallions worse than that one. Didn't take him weeks. Your father broke them, Rourke said from the fence where he hadn't moved. Wesley turned, looked at him like he was noticing a nail sticking up from a board. That's right. And how many of those horses were still sound 2 years later? The silence had a quality to it. Gideon looked into his coffee. Maren was very still. Wesley smiled, which was the kind of smile that meant he'd filed something away. I'm sure you know what you're doing, Maddox. I'm learning, Rourke said, and turned back to the corral. He felt Wesley's eyes on his back for a long moment before the man went back to his conversation with Gideon, and in that conversation Rourke heard the drift of it land, a proposal, the spring, a suitable time. He didn't look at Maren. He didn't need to. He could hear in the silences of what she said what she thought about the conversation she was standing inside. It was Cleet who explained it plainly, the next morning at the water trough. Danner's father and Harrow go back 30 years. The families have been neighbors since before either of them had what they have now. Cleet worked a piece of leather through his hands. Wesley's been coming around for about a year. Gideon figures it's a good match. Land adjoins, family stands. Wesley's not a bad man. But, Rourke said, Cleet was quiet for a moment. Miss Maren's not the kind of woman who does well being decided for. And Wesley's the kind of man who decides things. He shrugged. Maybe it works out fine. None of my business. Rourke said nothing. Cleet looked at him sideways. None of yours either, far as it goes. I know it. Just making sure. Rourke walked back to the corral. He thought about what Cleet had said the whole way. He knew it was true. He knew it wasn't his business. He'd been at Red Willow 9 days, and he had one job, and the job wasn't Maren Harrow. He knew all of that. He went into the corral with a rope he didn't use, just carried it coiled in his left hand so the horse could see it and know it wasn't a threat yet. And he stood in the middle of the corral and watched Midnight Crown's left ear. And he thought about a woman at a fence who told him things about a horse that nobody else had thought to notice. In the second week, the rhythm of it became something Rourke looked forward to without meaning to. Morning, corral. Midnight Crown growing gradually more curious and less terrified. The left ear learning to stay forward a little longer each day. The snorts getting shorter. The pacing settling, not into calm, not yet, but into something that was at least considering calm as a possibility. And Maren at the fence. She brought coffee one morning without asking if he wanted any. Just appeared with 2 cups and handed him one, and he noticed her hands were brown from the sun, and there was a faint old scar along the back of her left forearm that had the look of a fence wire cut, healed years ago. How old were you when you first worked with horses? He asked. She considered. 5, maybe. My mother let me help her with the gentling. She had a way with them. A pause. She died when I was 12. I'm sorry. She taught me everything useful I know about reading an animal. Maren looked at the stallion. My father taught me everything else. But when it comes to the horses, she stopped. Stays with you, Rourke said. Maren looked at him quickly, like he'd said something she hadn't expected. Then she looked back at the horse. Yes, she does. Rourke drank his coffee and thought that was probably the most personal thing she'd said to him. The most personal thing he'd said to anyone in a long time, too, for that matter. Wesley came around twice more that week. Both times he made a point of stopping at the corral to observe the progress. Rourke had the distinct impression he was being assessed, rather than the horse being assessed. On the second visit, Wesley leaned on the fence rail and watched Midnight Crown accept a rope around his neck for the first time, Rourke standing close. Loose pressure, the horse trembling but not bolting, and said, "How much longer?" Rourke kept his eyes on the horse. "Long as it takes." That's not an answer. It's the only honest one. Wesley was quiet. Then a horse needs to know who's in charge. That's not cruelty. That's just how horses work. Some horses, Rourke said, keeping his voice easy. This one already knows who's in charge of him. And who's that? Rourke glanced over briefly. His own fear. My job is to convince him he doesn't have to be afraid of me anymore. Different problem than authority. Wesley looked at him for a moment. Interesting philosophy. He straightened up and walked toward the house, where Maren had appeared on the porch, with a look on her face that Rourke couldn't quite read from where he stood. But he noticed she didn't walk out to meet Wesley at the gate. She waited on the porch. There was a difference, even if nobody was pointing it out. On the 14th day, something happened that nobody expected, including Rourke. He was in the corral, working the rope, moving Midnight Crown in slow circles, nothing forced, just getting the animal accustomed to direction, without fear, when Maren appeared at the fence, and the stallion stopped. He didn't stop because of Rourke. He stopped and looked at Maren, and his ears went forward. Both of them, all the way forward, pointed right at her, the way a horse's ears go when they've located something they recognize as safe. Rourke went very still. He watched. Midnight Crown took one step toward the fence. Then another. He walked to the rail, where Maren stood and lowered his enormous black head toward her hands. And she reached up slowly, no sudden moves, and laid her fingers against his jaw. The stallion shuddered, one full-body shudder, like something releasing, and then he stood. Rourke let out a breath he'd been holding. He walked to the fence and stood beside Maren, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be smaller than what had just happened. "He trusts you," Rourke finally said, quietly, like he was trying not to break the air. Maren kept her hand on the stallion's jaw. Her voice was careful. "He trusts that I won't hurt him." Same thing. She looked at him sideways. He looked back at her. And for a moment, that was maybe 3 seconds long, and felt considerably longer than that. The horse between them and the morning light on the pasture behind them. Rourke felt something shift in himself that he hadn't felt in a long time and hadn't been looking for and didn't entirely know what to do with. That evening, Gideon called Rourke into the study. He had a letter on the desk. He held it up, then laid it flat, like he wanted Rourke to be able to read it from across the room if he chose to. Army remount officer sent word ahead. He's coming in 6 weeks, not 8. Says he's heard about the black stallion and wants first look. He paused. Changes your timeline. Rourke thought about what had happened at the fence that afternoon. I need to move the schedule forward, but I don't want to push the horse faster than he's ready. I understand that. I'm asking if 6 weeks is possible. Possible. And if it's not? Rourke met his eyes. Then we'll know we tried the right way. Gideon studied him. You're not what I expected. Most people aren't. Gideon was quiet a moment. Maren says you listen. Rourke blinked slightly. She said that to you? She said it last night. Said you actually listen when she tells you something about the horse. Gideon's expression was hard to read, something between pride and a kind of low discomfort, like a man aware he's being paired to something and not sure he comes out well. My daughter doesn't offer that kind of observation about many people. Rourke didn't say what came to mind first. What he said instead was, she knows more about that horse than anyone on this property. She grew up around horses. That's not what I mean. Gideon looked at him. No, I suppose it isn't. He picked up his coffee and seemed to be thinking about something he wasn't ready to say. Maren's a beautiful woman. People have always, he stopped. Started again. I've wanted good things for her. A stable life. Someone who could provide properly. Wesley Danner, Rourke said. He's a good man. Good family, Rourke nodded slowly. I'm sure he is. He stood up and excused himself, and he walked back toward the bunkhouse in the cooling evening air, and thought about what it meant that a woman 30 years old had apparently not been asked, by anyone who loved her, what she wanted for her own life. In the 3rd week, Rourke put a saddle blanket on Midnight Crown. The horse didn't love it. He sidled and stamped and gave Rourke a look that communicated clearly that this was an outrage. But he didn't bolt. He stood there with his skin twitching under the unfamiliar weight, and gradually, over maybe 20 minutes, the twitching slowed and his breathing evened out and he accepted it. Maren watched from the fence. He's different, she said, after Rourke came out. From 3 weeks ago. He's remembering he doesn't have to be afraid of everything. Do horses do that? Remember something like that? Rourke leaned against the fence. They remember fear better than anything. But if you give them enough time and enough reason, they can learn to trust what they learned after the fear. He paused. Slower, but it sticks. She was quiet, looking at the horse. That sounds like it could apply to people. It does. She looked at him. Did you learn it from horses or people? He considered that honestly. Both. At different times. In different order. She almost smiled again. That almost smile was something he'd started noticing, like a weather event rare enough to pay attention to, brief enough that you had to be watching. My mother used to say, Maren said slowly, like she was deciding whether to share it, that the animals who've been hurt the worst are the ones who have the most to give, once they decide you're worth it. Rourke looked at her. He didn't say anything. He thought it was probably the wisest thing anyone had said to him in a long time. And he thought it was interesting that she'd attributed it to her mother rather than saying it plain as her own. Wesley Danner came for dinner that week. Rourke was not invited to dinner. He sat on the bunkhouse steps with his plate and listened to the distant sound of voices from the main house, Gideon's low, steady one, Wesley's carrying confidently across the yard, and Maren's, which he had to strain to hear, coming in shorter intervals, answering rather than initiating. Cleet came out and sat down 2 steps below him. Wesley asked Gideon for permission to formalize the arrangement, Cleet said. Not looking at him. Last week. Rourke said nothing. Gideon hasn't said yes or no yet, but Cleet turned his coffee cup in his hands. He's leaning. What does Maren think? Hasn't been asked, far as I can tell. Rourke set down his fork. How does that happen? Cleet gave him a long look. Harrow's a good man. He loves his daughter. But he's been looking at Maren her whole life and seeing a beautiful young woman who needs protecting. He searched for the words. He's not wrong that he loves her. He's just wrong about what she needs. They sat with that for a while. You've been here a long time, Rourke said. 19 years. And you've watched this. For about the last 5. Cleet stood up, brushed off his pants. Not my place to say a word about it. She knows what she is. She's always known. She'll make her own way eventually. He picked up his plate. Just might take longer than it should. He went inside. Rourke stayed on the steps and listened to the sound of Wesley Danner laughing at his own joke across the yard, and thought about a woman who knew exactly what she was and had spent 30 years in a house full of people who loved her and still managed to not quite see it. On the 22nd day, Rourke put the saddle on Midnight Crown. Full saddle, cinched. The horse went rigid the moment the weight settled, every muscle locked, his breath coming in short, hard bursts. Rourke kept one hand on his neck and talked not anything meaningful, just a low, steady stream of nothing words. The way you talk to someone coming out of a bad dream, just to give them a sound that's not a threat. 2 minutes. 5. 8 minutes in, Midnight Crown took a breath that came from his belly. His neck dropped an inch. Rourke stepped back. Maren was at the fence. Her knuckles were white on the rail. She had been watching without breathing, or close to it, and when the horse dropped his neck, she exhaled sharply and put one hand over her mouth. It's okay, Rourke said. I know. Her voice was unsteady. She stopped, looked at the horse. Nobody was ever patient enough with him. You were. I couldn't do what you're doing. I don't have the training. You told me about the right hindquarter. You told me about the left ear. You figured out the feeding schedule. You're the reason he trusts the fence rail enough to come to it at all. Rourke held her eyes. What I'm doing is following your observations. She stared at him. I mean that, he said. She looked away first. Back to the horse. After a moment, she said very quietly, Nobody has ever said that to me before. Rourke thought there were probably a dozen things he could say to that. He said none of them. He turned back to Midnight Crown and kept his hand on the saddle and let the morning go at its own pace. Behind him, at the fence, he could feel her still there. He was aware of it the way you're aware of warmth near a fire, not consciously, not trying to, just knowing. He stayed in the corral for 2 more hours, and she stayed at the fence. Neither of them remarked on it, but neither of them moved until they had to. That evening stayed with Rourke longer than he wanted it to. He lay on his bunk after the ranch had gone quiet and stared at the ceiling boards and thought about what Maren had said. Nobody has ever said that to me before, and the way she'd looked away immediately after, like she'd given something away that she hadn't planned to. He'd heard a lot of things from a lot of people over 15 years of moving from ranch to ranch. He'd heard gratitude and complaints and hard luck stories and boasts. He'd gotten good at letting most of it pass through him without leaving a mark. That one left a mark. He wasn't sure what to do with that, so he did what he usually did with things he wasn't sure about. He set it aside and went to sleep, but it was there again when he woke up. The 23rd day started like the other's gray light coming through the small bunkhouse window, the horses already moving in the pre-dawn quiet, Cleet's boots on the floor 2 bunks down, the smell of coffee from the cook stove. Rourke dressed, poured himself a cup, and walked out into the cool morning with his hands wrapped around the warmth of it. The sky over the eastern pasture had gone from gray to that particular pale orange that happened for about 10 minutes every morning, before the sun got serious about the day. Midnight Crown was at the far end of the corral, watching him. Rourke stopped at the fence. "Yeah," he said to the horse. "Me too." He drank his coffee, and they regarded each other across the distance, and it occurred to him that the horse had stopped pacing sometime in the last few days, without him registering exactly when. The stallion still moved, still shifted and turned, and kept himself facing toward anything that changed, but the constant tight circling was gone. In its place was something more like vigilance than panic, watching the world carefully instead of running from it in place. It was a significant difference. He was still thinking about it when Maren appeared at the fence 20 minutes later. She came from the house side, same as always, coffee in hand, same loose braid as most mornings. She looked at the horse before she looked at him, which he'd come to expect, and she said, "He was at that end of the corral last night, too. After dark. Just standing there. Watching the house? Watching my window." She said it without any particular inflection. Just a thing she'd noticed. "I left the lamp on for a while to see if it bothered him." It didn't. "He's looking for something predictable," Rourke said. "Light in the same window every night. Same person at the fence every morning. It's anchoring him." She looked at the horse. "I didn't think about it that way. I just kept the lamp on because she stopped." "Because?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I didn't like the idea of him standing in the dark alone." Rourke looked at her. She didn't return the look. She kept her eyes on Midnight Crown with the expression of someone who said more than they planned and is waiting to see if the other person notices. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it. What he said was, "I'm going to try sitting on him today." Just sitting. No direction, no pressure. Just the weight of a person on his back. Maren's hands tightened slightly on the fence rail. Is he ready for that? "I think he's as ready as he's going to be before he's ready." He finished his coffee. There's a gap between almost ready and actually ready that you can only close by going through it. She looked at him then. "Is that true for horses specifically or everything?" "Everything," he said. She turned back to the horse. He could see her working something through in her head, and he had learned enough the way she thought to know that when she went quiet like that it wasn't absence, it was the opposite of absence. She was somewhere busy and internal and working on something real. "Wesley's coming this afternoon," she said after a while. Her voice had shifted not much, but he caught it. "Something careful in it now." "I know." Cleet mentioned it. "He wants to see the progress on the horse. A beat." That's what he said. Rourke looked at the pasture. "And what do you think he wants?" She exhaled slowly. "He wants to see if you're close to done." Rourke said nothing. "If you finish the horse," she said, and stopped. Started again. "My father made certain things clear to Wesley about the timeline. Once the horse is settled," she pressed her lips together, "things move forward. For you. Yes, and does anyone ask you about that?" Question sat in the air between them. Midnight Crown turned his head and looked at them from across the corral, ears forward, like he was paying attention. "My father asks," Maren said carefully in his way. "He says things like, 'Is there any reason you'd object?' And I'm supposed to understand that the question has already been answered, and he's just checking that I won't cause a scene." "That's not asking." "No, it isn't." She set her coffee cup on the fence post. "But he loves me. I know he does. She shook her head. "He sees something when he looks at me that I don't entirely recognize." "What does he see?" "Someone who needs arranging for." She said it without bitterness, which was almost worse than bitterness would have been. Like she'd stopped being angry about it and settled into something more permanent. "He sees my mother in me, I think. She was beautiful and gentle, and she let him run everything, and they were happy. Trying to reproduce that. For me. Are you like your mother?" She thought about it seriously, which he appreciated. "In some ways. But she was at peace with her life in a way I'm not." She picked up her cup. Chose it. He forgot that part. They stood at the fence for another few minutes without talking. Midnight Crown had started drifting toward them, not quickly, not directly, but in that angled, casual-looking way that horses moved when they were pretending they weren't doing what they were doing. "He's coming over," Maren said quietly. "Don't look at him directly." She looked at the sky instead. Rourke looked at the ground. Midnight Crown drifted another 10 feet closer, stopped, dropped his head to check the ground for something that wasn't there, drifted another 5 feet. He does this every morning now, Maren murmured. Comes about this close and then stops. He's deciding whether we're worth it. And? Jury's still out, Rourke said. But he keeps coming back, so that means something. The stallion stopped at about 8 feet from the rail. He stood and breathed, and looked at them with his enormous dark eyes, and for a moment the three of them existed in a kind of suspended quiet, and then Rourke slowly reached into his jacket pocket and produced a flat piece of dried apple. He held it over the top rail. Midnight Crown's nostrils worked. His ears went forward. He was very still for a long count, and then he walked to the fence and took the apple from Rourke's hand with a delicacy that seemed almost impossible for an animal his size. Maren made a sound beside him. Not quite a word. Something smaller than that. Something surprised and moved. Rourke passed her a second piece of apple without looking at her. She held it out over the rail. Midnight Crown hesitated. Then he stretched his neck and took it from her too. She laughed a short, genuine, slightly disbelieving sound, and then seemed surprised by herself for laughing. Covered it quickly. But Rourke had heard it, and it was the best sound he'd heard in longer than he could easily calculate. All right, he said, setting down his cup. Let's go to work. He went into the corral, and today, for the first time, Midnight Crown didn't go to the far corner when the gate opened. He stayed where he was and watched Rourke come to him. That was how the 23rd day began. What happened next took 3 hours and required more patience than Rourke had needed to call on in recent memory, but it was the kind of patience that didn't feel like waiting. It felt like listening very carefully to something that was trying to tell you when it was ready. He worked the rope first, let the horse get bored of it, brought the saddle blanket and left it on the rail nearby until Midnight Crown had sniffed at it 12 times and decided it wasn't going to kill him. Put the blanket on, took it off, put it on again. By the third time, the horse didn't react at all, which was exactly what Rourke was looking for. He got the saddle from outside the corral, the same saddle that had been sitting on the fence rail for 4 days now, so the smell of it was already familiar, and he set it on the horse's back and cinched it slowly and talked the entire time about nothing, about the weather, about a ranch in Idaho where he'd worked 2 years prior, about the particular quality of the light in the eastern pasture at this hour. Words that didn't mean anything, a voice that did. Midnight Crown stood. He breathed. Rourke put his foot in the stirrup and felt the horse's whole body tighten in response, and he held that position 1 foot in the iron, weight on the left side for a long, long time. Not moving, just letting the animal understand that the weight wasn't an attack. From the fence, Maren watched without making a sound. It was another 20 minutes before Rourke swung his leg over. He sat in the saddle on Midnight Crown, and the horse did not move and did not breathe, and the world held itself still. Then the stallion exhaled, 1 breath, long and deep. Rourke sat there for 10 minutes without asking the horse for anything at all. Just the fact of him there, weight in the saddle, hands quiet on the reins. At the 8-minute mark, Midnight Crown shifted his weight from 1 foot to the other. A small, casual adjustment, the kind of thing a horse did when it had decided the situation was survivable. Rourke dismounted slowly, ran his hand down the stallion's neck, and walked out of the corral. Maren was gripping the rail with both hands. Her eyes were bright, and she was pressing her lips together with the effort of not saying something too large for the moment. "That's it," one of the hands said, somewhere behind Rourke. Sounded like Pete, the youngest one, who had the habit of narrating his own confusion out loud. "He just sat there?" "That's everything," Rourke said without turning around. He looked at Maren instead. She looked back at him, and for a moment he could see all of it in her face, the relief and the pride, in something that had nothing to do with the horse at all. She blinked it back, put her practical expression back on like a piece of clothing. "Good," she said. It came out slightly unsteady. He pretended not to notice. "Yeah," he said. "Good." Wesley arrived that afternoon while Rourke was cleaning tack in the barn. He heard the buggy, heard Gideon come out to meet it, heard the voices moving toward the house. Then he heard the footsteps change direction and come toward the barn instead, and he knew by the pace of them too deliberate, with the particular confidence of a man who has decided to have a conversation, that this wasn't going to be a brief visit. Wesley appeared in the barn doorway. He had his hat in his hand and he turned it as he stood there, which was the only thing about him that suggested anything other than complete ease. Maddox. Danner, Rourke kept working on the bridle. Heard you made some progress today. Some. Wesley came inside, looked around the barn the way men did when they were buying time. When do you expect the horse to be fully rideable? When he's ready. That's not an answer, I know. Still the true one. Wesley stopped turning his hat. He set it on a post and put both hands in his pockets. Let me be plain with you. I'd appreciate that. The Army officer comes in 5 weeks. Gideon needs that horse ready. The sale is important not just financially, but in terms of what it means for this family. A successful sale, a stable arrangement. He let that sit. There are things Gideon has been working toward for his daughter that depend on everything here moving forward on schedule. Rourke set down the bridle. He turned and looked at Wesley directly. I'm going to work the horse the way the horse needs to be worked. You want a guarantee on the timeline. Talk to the horse. Wesley looked at him for a moment, not angry, evaluating. You're not going to make this easy. I'm not making it anything. I'm doing my job. Your job, Wesley said, is to get that horse ready. Not to spend 5 weeks having morning conversations at the fence. The barn went very quiet. Rourke said evenly, You keeping track of the conversations at the fence? I'm keeping track of what's happening on this property. He paused, chose a different word. I have an interest in how things go here. Maren's not a thing on this property. The words came out before Rourke had fully decided to say them. He heard them land. Wesley's expression shifted. That's a curious thing to say. The accurate thing to say. They looked at each other for a long beat. Outside, a horse moved in the corral. Somewhere in the house, Gideon was saying something to someone, his voice carrying faintly through the afternoon heat. I'm going to marry that woman, Wesley said. Not threatening. Almost conversational. Gideon and I have had that discussion. She knows the direction of things. What does she know, exactly? That it's a good match. That it's right for this family. That's not what she knows, Rourke said. That's what she's been told. Wesley picked up his hat. I like you better when you're quiet, Maddox. That's all right. I'm not trying to be liked. Wesley put his hat on and walked out of the barn without saying anything else. Rourke listened to his steps cross the yard, listened to the voices on the porch, listened to the sound of a man entirely confident that things were going to proceed as he'd arranged for them to proceed. He picked up the bridle and went back to work, but his jaw was tight and his hands were a little stiff, and he knew the feeling for what it was, even if he wasn't ready to name it yet. That evening, Maren found him at the fence after supper. She stood where she usually stood, but she didn't look at the horse right away. She looked at her own hands on the rail. Wesley told me you two talked, she said. He mentioned the timeline. He told me you were, she glanced over. Difficult. I expect I was. He said you had an opinion about things that weren't your business. Rourke was quiet for a moment. I might have, depending on what he meant. Maren looked at Midnight Crown. The stallion was still at the near end of the corral, which was new. He was spending more time near the fence where people were, and less time at the far end where he'd once retreated from everything. What did you say to him? That you're not a thing on this property. She went very still. He was talking about you like you're part of the arrangements, Rourke said. Land and horse and daughter. Same category. She didn't say anything. You can tell me it's not my business, he said. It probably isn't. It's not, she said. But she said it quietly, without the decisiveness that would have meant she believed it entirely. But she stopped. Nobody has said that to him before. About me. Somebody should have, she exhaled, looked at the horse. Wesley isn't cruel. I want you to understand that. He's not a bad man. He's just, she thought about it. He's the kind of man who sees the world in terms of what belongs where. And he's decided I belong in a category he can manage. And you? I know what I am. She said it simply, without defiance or performance. Just a fact about herself she'd known for a long time. I know what I'm capable of. I know what I see in these animals, what I understand that other people walk past without noticing. I know it. Her jaw tightened slightly. But knowing it and being able to do something with it, she shook her head. Those are two different things when everyone around you has already decided what your life looks like. Rourke thought about that. He thought about 15 years of moving, never staying, never being decided for, never belonging to a place or a plan someone else had drawn. He'd thought for a long time that was freedom. Standing here now, looking at this woman, he wondered for the first time if it was also just a different kind of cage. What would you do, he said slowly, if the arrangements weren't made, if nobody had decided? She looked at him. He met her eyes and held them. I'd run this breeding program, she said. The horses on this ranch, the rehabilitation work. I've had ideas for it for years, and my father keeps saying yes, yes, one day. When there's time, she stopped. I'd work with animals like Midnight Crown, animals that have been broken down by people who didn't understand what was wrong. Her chin lifted slightly. I'm good at it. You know I am. I know you are. And I'd... She stopped again. Something moved across her face that she didn't finish saying. She looked back at the horse. It doesn't matter. It does. Rourke. She said his name for the first time, and he felt it differently than he expected to. Don't make this harder for me. He understood what she meant. He didn't push. He turned and looked at Midnight Crown, and they stood together at the fence in the cooling evening. And after a while, Maren's shoulder relaxed by about 1 degree, and she stopped holding herself quite so carefully. And that 1 degree felt like something significant, even if he couldn't have said exactly what. Cleet appeared from the barn, saw them, and detoured without slowing down or commenting. He'd been doing that for about a week now. Rourke appreciated it. In the 4th week, the rhythm changed. Rourke was riding Midnight Crown. Not pushing, nothing like that. Just walking. Walk, stop, walk, turn. Walk again. Asking for small things and releasing the pressure the moment the horse offered them. The stallion was stiff on the right still careful about anything coming from that side, still occasionally sent into a moment of full-body tension by something Rourke couldn't always identify. But he was walking under saddle. He was responding to the reins. He was not calm, not entirely, but functional, present. Choosing cooperation instead of panic. The ranch hands had stopped making comments. Pete, the youngest one, actually said to Rourke one morning, with the careful awkwardness of someone delivering a compliment they weren't sure they had the right to give, "That's something, what you're doing with him." I didn't think it was possible. Maren told me what was wrong with him in the first 10 minutes, Rourke said. The rest was just time. Pete looked uncomfortable in the way young men did when they'd missed something obvious that a woman had caught. She did mention it. I thought she was. He stopped. What? Being gentle? About the horse? Like how she is? Rourke looked at him. She was being accurate. About the horse. Like how she is. Pete went back to his fence post with the expression of someone recalibrating something they'd been confident about. Maren was present for most of the riding sessions. She'd moved from the outer fence to the inner rail closer now, within the work itself, offering observations while Rourke rode that were almost always right and occasionally essential. When the stallion started telegraphing tension through the left ear, she'd say it before Rourke felt it. When the right hindquarter got stiff, she'd see the shift in his hip before it registered in his forward movement. You should be the one riding him, Rourke said one afternoon. She looked startled. I'm not saying today. But eventually, he leaned on the saddle horn. You understand what he's doing before I feel it. That means your hands would be quieter. Quieter hands, calmer horse. Stared at him. My father would have something to say about that. I imagine he would. That doesn't change whether it's true. She looked at the horse for a long moment. He could see her wanting it, a physical wanting, the kind that showed itself in the lean of a person's body toward a thing, in the way their hands moved on the rail. One thing at a time, she said finally. Yeah, he said. Okay. It was around this time that something else shifted between them, something small but unmistakable, the way a door shifts when the latch catches and you realize it's now closed, and you're not entirely sure when that happened. They started talking about things that had nothing to do with the horse. He told her about Montana, the ranch he'd spent 2 winters at, The way the cold came in from the north, so clean and sharp you could taste it. The particular loneliness of watching a landscape that beautiful with no one to say anything to about it. Told him about a summer she'd spent at 16 on her uncle's property, 2 days east, the first time she'd been somewhere. Her father wasn't deciding things. The way the freedom of it had felt like sunlight on new skin, overwhelming and good and over too soon. He told her about the accident he'd had at 24, a horse that wasn't like Midnight Crown, wasn't frightened, was genuinely dangerous, and had put him in a doctor's bed for 6 weeks with 2 broken ribs and a fracture in his left wrist that still predicted rain. She held his left wrist and turned it over in her hands, examining the old break, running her thumb along where the bone had knit unevenly, and he sat very still and let her. And she said, "Did you think about stopping? After?" "For about a week," he said. "Then I went back." "Why?" He thought about it honestly. "Because it was the only thing I knew how to do that I could also do right." She set his wrist down, not abruptly, carefully. "I know that feeling." She told him her mother's name had been Clara, and that Clara had died quickly, which was a mercy and also a cruelty because there hadn't been time to say everything. She told him she still sometimes talked to the horses as if her mother was listening through them, which she said with a small, dry acknowledgement of how it sounded. "It doesn't sound strange," Rourke said. "It sounds strange." "All right. It sounds strange, and it also makes complete sense." She looked at him. "You're a peculiar man, Rourke Maddox." "I've been told. It's not an insult." "I know." He looked at the pasture. "Most of the interesting things about people sound a little strange if you say them plainly." She was quiet for a moment. "What's strange about you then, if we're being plain?" He thought about it. "I've been moving for 15 years because I told myself I preferred it. But I think the real reason is that it's easier to leave a place than to stay in it and find out whether it wants you to stay." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Maren didn't say anything. He hadn't really expected her to. But she stayed at the fence for another hour after that, and she didn't bring up Wesley, and she didn't talk about the Army timeline, and she didn't say anything about arrangements or decisions. She just stayed, and they watched the horse together in the long late afternoon light, and it was one of the better hours Rourke had spent in longer than he could calculate. The letter came on a Thursday. Rourke opened it at the breakfast table, while Cleet pretended to be occupied with his eggs. The letterhead was Army official, clean paper, the particular formatting of government correspondence. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. Cleet waited until the other hands had cleared out. "Army," he said. "Remount officer. The one coming to see Midnight Crown." Rourke poured more coffee. "He's heard I'm the one working the horse. He has a proposition." "What kind?" 6 months of contract work. Assessing and breaking horses for remount purposes across 3 territories. Good pay. Significant pay. He looked at his cup. He says it's the kind of work that puts a man's name on the right doors. Cleet was quiet for a moment. "That's a considerable offer." "It is. You going to take it?" Rourke thought about a woman at a fence with her thumb along an old break in his wrist. He thought about a stallion that had learned to walk to the rail in the morning because the fence meant something safe now. He thought about 15 years of exactly the kind of work the letter was describing and what he'd accumulated from it, and whether accumulated was even the right word for what happened to a man who moved that consistently and that long. "Haven't decided," he said. Cleet nodded slowly, said nothing else. That afternoon, Rourke rode Midnight Crown for 40 minutes at a sustained walk, and then carefully, with full attention on the left ear, asked for a trot. The stallion hesitated. Then he moved forward. Rourke sat the trot and felt the power of the animal under him, that particular, almost unreasonable power of a horse this size moving forward willingly, and he thought, there he is. There's the horse Gideon paid for. There's what was always underneath the fear. He brought him back to a walk, stopped him, sat there. Maren was at the fence, both hands on the rail, and her expression was the one he'd been waiting to see, not the almost smile. Not the careful one, the real one, open and unguarded. Just for a moment, the face of someone watching something they believed in finally prove itself right. Rourke thought about the letter in his pocket. He thought about it for a long time after that. And he still hadn't decided by the time the sun went down except that he was aware, in the most inconvenient way possible, that the thing pulling him towards staying and the thing he was supposed to be doing had become very difficult to separate from each other, and he wasn't entirely sure that was a problem he knew how to solve. The letter stayed in Rourke's shirt pocket for 3 days. He didn't take it out again. He didn't need to. He'd read it twice, and he had a good memory, and the numbers were not the kind of numbers a man forgot. But he also didn't throw it away, which told him something about where he was in the decision, even if he wasn't ready to admit it out loud. Cleet didn't ask again. That was one of the better things about Cleet. He asked a thing once, filed the answer or the non-answer, and moved on. The younger hands wouldn't have managed that. Pete, in particular, had a habit of circling back to things he was curious about, the way a dog returned to a spot it had smelled something interesting. But Cleet had been around long enough to know that some questions answered themselves if you left them alone. The work with Midnight Crown moved into a new phase. Trot work, direction changes, asking the stallion to move away from leg pressure, which was the kind of thing that felt simple, and wasn't it required the horse to trust that pressure didn't mean pain, that a squeeze of the leg was a request and not a punishment, and that trust was built the same way all trust was built, which was slowly and through consistent evidence and not through wanting it to go faster. Some days the evidence came in cleanly. Other days Midnight Crown reminded everyone that he was a 16-hand stallion with a memory for bad experiences and opinions about how the world worked. On the 29th day, he spooked at a feed sack that Pete had left propped against the corral fence, went sideways hard enough that Rourke lost a stirrup and had to grab Mane to stay on, and then circled the corral twice at a pace that was somewhere between a fast trot and a collected panic before Rourke could bring him down. By the time the horse stopped, both of them were breathing harder than the situation strictly required. Rourke sat there for a moment and took inventory of himself. Nothing hurt beyond the normal ache of catching yourself mid-fall. His dignity had taken a light bruising, but he'd learned a long time ago not to be too precious about his dignity around horses. From the fence, Maren said, "Pete." Pete appeared from somewhere near the barn. "Yeah? Move the feed sack." Pete looked at the feed sack, looked at the horse, looked at Rourke, still catching his breath in the saddle. "I didn't think it would. Move it, please." Pete moved it. Rourke walked Midnight Crown in a slow circle until the animal's head came down and his breathing steadied. When he dismounted, he ran his hand down the stallion's neck and said, very quietly, "I know. Me too, sometimes," which was not the kind of thing you said out loud to a horse if you were concerned about what the ranch hands thought of you, but Rourke had stopped being concerned about that approximately 2 weeks ago. Maren was at the rail when he came out. "He's better than he was," she said. Today was a setback. Today was a feed sack. She looked at the horse, who had gone back to the near end of the corral and was regarding the now absent sack location with residual suspicion. "You had him through 3 direction changes this morning before that. That's not a setback. That's a bad 5 minutes in a good week." Rourke looked at her. "You're doing the thing," she said, "where you wait the bad moment more than the good hour." "Am I? You told me horses remember fear better than anything else." "You apparently do too." He almost laughed. It came out as a breath through his nose, which was as close as he got most days. "You pay attention. You've noticed that about me." First thing I noticed. She looked away, but not before he caught the expression something warm and slightly undone around the edges, there for half a second, and then collected back into composure. She had very good composure. He was getting better at seeing through it. "The army officer sent a second letter," she said after a moment. He went still. "My father mentioned it at supper." She kept her eyes on the horse. He seemed pleased. He said the offer was significant. "Your father knows the contents of my mail?" The officer wrote to my father as well. "Apparently he wanted to ensure your availability wasn't complicated." She paused. His word. "Complicated," Rourke repeated. "He wanted to know if you had any obligations here that would prevent you from accepting." The word obligation sat in the air with more weight than it should have, and both of them knew why. "What did your father tell him?" Rourke asked. "That your contract was for the horse and nothing else." Rourke was quiet. "He's right," Maren said. Her voice was level. "That is what your contract is for. It's a good offer." Cleet said it's the kind of offer men in your line of work spend years hoping for. She finally looked at him. Her eyes were steady in the way they went steady when she was holding something in place by force. You should take it. I haven't decided. You should decide. Why? She looked at him for a moment and then looked away, and he understood she was telling him to go because she didn't know what happened if he stayed, and not knowing was worse than losing the thing that might have been there. He recognized that particular logic because he'd lived by a version of it for 15 years. I'm not going anywhere right now, he said. The horse isn't ready. He's close. Close isn't ready. She didn't argue. She pushed off the fence rail and walked back toward the house. And he watched her go, and he thought about what it meant that a woman was telling him to leave, because she was trying to protect something, him or herself or both. He wasn't sure, and how that was the kind of thing a person did when they'd gotten used to loss and had learned to get ahead of it. He didn't like that she was that practiced at it. He went back into the corral. Midnight Crown watched him come. Don't look at me like that, Rourke said to the horse. The horse kept looking at him exactly like that. The Army remount officer arrived 3 weeks before his originally scheduled date. His name was Captain Aldous Greer, and he was a precise, lean man in his 50s who wore his uniform like it had been pressed onto him and would take a crowbar to remove. He came with a junior officer who said nothing and wrote things in a small book, and he shook hands with Gideon on the porch with the formality of a man conducting a transaction he'd already decided the terms of. He was polite to Maren in the way men of his generation and position were polite to women, thorough and impersonal, a courtesy extended to a category rather than a person. He didn't look at her twice. He looked at Midnight Crown for a long time. Rourke stood beside the corral and watched the captain's face while Greer watched the horse, and what he saw was a man recalculating. Captain had come expecting a problem horse being worked toward acceptability. What he found was Midnight Crown tacked and settled, ears forward, carrying himself with the contained power of an animal that had remembered what it was capable of when it wasn't afraid. That's the horse from the report, Greer said to Rourke. Yes, sir. I was told he'd put 2 men in the doctor. He did. Greer looked at Rourke, and you've had him 3 weeks past the original timeline. 5 weeks total. What was the issue? He'd been badly handled after arrival. Right hindquarter. Someone used a war bridle and a twitch simultaneously for a routine shoeing. Rourke kept his voice even. He wasn't vicious. He was in pain and then terrified of being in pain again. Greer's expression didn't shift, but something behind it did. Who identified the source? Miss Harrow noticed the behavioral indicators before I arrived. She told me in the first conversation I had on this property. Greer looked toward the house. Harrow's daughter. Yes. The captain looked back at the horse. Well, she was right. He clasped his hands behind his back. I'd like to see him ridden. Rourke went in and put Midnight Crown through 40 minutes that were, if he was honest, the best 40 minutes they'd had. The stallion was present and responsive in a way that still surprised him, sometimes the feeling of an animal that had been all locked doors and now had something open in it, some willingness that the fear had been covering. Walk, trot, direction changes, a stop and rein back that Midnight Crown offered so cleanly Rourke almost didn't ask for it. When he dismounted and walked out of the corral, Greer was quiet for a moment. Maddox, he said, my offer stands, I know, you've read the letter. Twice. Then you know it's not a small offer. It's not a small offer, Rourke agreed. I need an answer within the week. We move to the next territory after Harrow's horse is purchased, and I need to know if you're coming. Greer fixed him with the look of a man accustomed to people saying yes to him. This is the kind of work that builds a reputation that follows you for the rest of your career. 6 months of it would set you up to name your price for the next 20 years. Rourke looked at the corral. Midnight Crown had gone to the near rail and was standing there with his head over the fence, waiting. I'll have an answer for you by Friday, Rourke said. Greer nodded. I'll be at the Harrow table for supper tonight. I understand there's a family there who wants to celebrate the progress. A brief, precise smile. You're welcome to join us, Maddox. Harrow extended the invitation. He went toward the house. Rourke stood at the corral and let Midnight Crown put his nose against his chest. Yeah, he said, I know. He didn't go to supper. He told Cleet to pass his regrets. ate at the bunkhouse, and sat on the steps afterward, listening to the sound of the main house lamplight and voices, the particular sound of a good supper being had by people with something to celebrate. He could hear Greer's precise voice occasionally. Wesley's, which had arrived on horseback an hour after Greer, carrying louder and easier. Gideon's. He didn't hear Maren, which might have meant she wasn't talking much, or might have meant he was listening too specifically. Pete came and sat near him, not too close. The kid had learned some things about proximity over the past weeks. "You're not eating with them," Pete said. "You noticed." "Captain seems like a serious man." "He is." Pete was quiet for a moment. "The offer he made you," Cleet said, "it's the kind of thing men in your position don't turn down." "Men in my position," Rourke said. "I didn't mean anything by it." "I know you didn't." Rourke looked at the stars coming out over the eastern pasture. "It's a good offer." "So you're taking it?" Rourke said nothing. Pete, learning, didn't push. They sat in the quiet for a while, and at some point, the lamp went on in the upstairs window, the window Maren had told him she left lit for the horse and Midnight Crown, in the corral, moved toward that end of the fence without being asked. Rourke watched that and felt something settle into him that he couldn't quite classify. Not peace, not resolution, just the feeling of understanding a thing clearly that you've been looking at sideways. The trouble was that understanding something clearly and knowing what to do about it were still two entirely different problems. The next morning, Wesley tried to ride Midnight Crown. Rourke found out about it after the fact, which was the only mercy in the situation, because if he'd been there for the beginning of it, he would have said something he couldn't unsay. What happened, as best he could reconstruct from Pete's account, and Cleet's more measured one, was this. Wesley had arrived early, before Rourke was at the corral. Greer had expressed admiration for the horse at supper the previous night, enthusiasm about his potential, numbers that had apparently made everyone at the table sit up straighter. Wesley, who had been at that table, had heard those numbers. And Wesley, who had opinions about what demonstrated a man's capability and standing, had decided that riding Midnight Crown before Rourke did it again would demonstrate something useful. He'd gotten the saddle on. That much, Pete said, had gone all right. The horse was used to the tack now. But Wesley had mounted fast and hard. The way a confident man mounted a horse, he'd decided, was no longer a problem. And he'd immediately gone for contact on the reins, firm contact. Kind that said who's in charge here, and Midnight Crown's left ear had gone flat in about a quarter second. He started circling, Pete said, and Wesley tried to pull him up short. The horse went sideways into the rail. "Where was everyone?" Rourke said. "Cleet was at the barn. I was at the water trough. We heard the noise and came running." "Where was Maren?" Pete paused. "She was at the fence. She'd come out same as always, and she saw Wesley going in, and she said—" He stopped. "What did she say?" "She told him not to. She said the horse wasn't ready for that kind of handling yet, that he needed more time with the right contact work." Pete looked uncomfortable. Wesley told her he appreciated her concern. Rourke set his jaw. "And then," he said, "and then the horse went to pieces." He got the rest of it in pieces from various sources over the next 20 minutes, and the picture it made was not a good one. Midnight Crown had gone from a controlled spin to a full panic, which was the difference between a bad day and a disaster. He'd hit the far fence with his hindquarters, the same hindquarters that still carried the memory of the worst day of his life, and that contact had sent him forward in a lunge that cleared Wesley out of the saddle entirely. Wesley had hit the ground on his feet, which was luck, and gotten himself over the fence rail before the horse came around again. The junior officer had pulled Greer back from the corral gate. 2 hands had scattered, and Maren had gone in. Rourke heard that part last from Clet, who had arrived at the corral in time to see it. "She went in through the gate on the opposite side," Cleet said. He was leaning on the barn wall, and he had the expression of a man who had seen something that rearranged certain things in his understanding of the world. "She didn't run, she just walked in, steady, talking the whole time." "What was she saying?" "I couldn't hear it from where I was." "Just her voice, low and even." He was quiet a moment. "The horse was still moving when she got in there. Still hot." But he started turning toward her voice. Rourke had stopped walking. "She put herself between the horse and the fence where his hindquarters had hit, Cleet said. And she kept talking, and Midnight Crown he slowed down. Turned toward her, and he stopped. The silence in the barn was complete. She had her hand on his neck when I got to the gate, Cleet said. The horse was shaking. She was shaking too, but her hand was steady. He looked at Rourke. She was the only reason that horse didn't go through the fence. Rourke walked to the corral. Maren was still there. The other men had dispersed. Gideon had said something to them from the porch that Rourke hadn't caught, but whatever it was, it had moved them. Wesley was at the water pump, cleaning the dust off himself, with the focused attention of a man who wanted to appear occupied. Greer stood with his junior officer at a careful distance, watchful. Maren stood at Midnight Crown's head with her hand on his jaw, the same way she'd stood that first morning when the horse had come to the fence. The stallion was still breathing hard, but his ears were forward. His head was down. She was talking to him very quietly, and he was listening. Rourke came through the gate slowly. She glanced at him. Her face was pale, and there was a smear of dust on her sleeve where she must have touched the fence or the horse, and her jaw was set tight. But her hand on the stallion's jaw was completely still. "I've got him," she said. "I know you do." He came to the horse's right side, the careful side, the remembered side, and set his hand on the neck near hers, not replacing her, just adding to it. Midnight Crown's ear flicked toward him. The breathing slowed another degree. "He's all right," Rourke said to the horse. To her. To both of them. They stood like that for a while. The three of them in the corral while the day went on around them. Gideon's voice on the porch, the sound of Wesley's boots on the pump platform, the junior officer's pencil moving in his small book. "She was right," Maren said quietly. "My mother. About the ones who've been hurt the worst." Rourke looked at her. "He could have gone through that fence," she said. Her voice was steady but thin, like thread pulled too tight. If he'd gone through the fence, he could have broken both hindquarters. He could have. She stopped. He trusted the fence, because the fence meant something safe to him now. And someone took that and used it wrong. He didn't go through it. "Because I got to him." "Yes." She finally looked up from the horse's face. Her hazel eyes were bright, with something she was not going to let become tears, not here, not in front of Greer and the junior officer and her father's suitor brushing dust off his jacket. Rourke could see the effort of it, and he respected it, and he also thought she shouldn't have to work so hard to keep herself together in front of people who should have been the ones who knew better. "You did something very brave," he said. "It wasn't brave," she said. "It was just necessary. Brave things usually are." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she looked back at the horse. "He needs to stand quietly for a while. Will you stay?" "Stay," he said. So they stood there together, hand alongside hand on Midnight Crown's neck, and after a while the horse's breathing went all the way even, and his weight settled onto all 4 feet with the distributed ease of an animal that had come back to himself. And Rourke felt the tension go out of Maren's arm by degrees, the same gradual release as the stallion's. From outside the fence, he heard Gideon's voice, different from earlier. Something in it that hadn't been there at supper last night. Quieter, working at something. He'd watched his daughter walk into a corral with a panicked horse. He'd watched what happened after. Rourke didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the horse and his hands steady, and he thought about what it meant for a man to see a thing plainly that he'd been looking at sideways for years. Wesley came to the fence when they came out of the corral. He had his hat back on, and his jacket settled, and he'd gotten most of the dust off, and he had the expression of a man who had prepared something to say and was going to say it. "I underestimated his reaction," Wesley said to Rourke. Not to Maren, who was standing 2 feet away. "Yes," Rourke said. "It won't happen again." "No, it won't," he held Wesley's eyes. "You won't go into that corral again without my explicit say-so. That's not negotiable, and it's not a suggestion." Wesley's jaw tightened. "You don't run this ranch, Maddox. I run that corral. That's in my contract, and Gideon knows it." Rourke's voice stayed even. "You could have ruined 5 weeks of work in 3 minutes. You nearly hurt yourself, and the horse, and potentially others. That's not confidence. That's not knowing who's in charge." He stepped slightly closer. That's not understanding the difference between a frightened animal and a defiant one, which is the same thing as not understanding the difference between a woman who can't speak for herself and one who has simply been talked over. The silence went flat and tight. Wesley looked from Rourke to Maren and back. Something moved across his face, not quite anger, not quite embarrassment. Something between them, uneasy and complicated. "Maren," he said. His voice shifted, softer, which was possibly worse. "I hope you know my intention was never—" "I know what your intention was," she said. Her voice was remarkably composed. "You wanted to show Captain Greer something impressive." Wesley opened his mouth. "And you decided," she continued, "that what I said at the fence didn't require any particular consideration before you went ahead." He closed his mouth. "It never really does," she said. "Does it with you?" She walked past him toward the house. Wesley watched her go. Rourke watched Wesley watch her, and what he saw on the man's face was more complicated than he'd expected. There was something genuinely confused there. The look of a man who had believed he was being considerate and has been told, clearly, that he wasn't, and who is now running backward through his accounting of himself and finding the numbers don't add up the way he thought they did. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't enough, either. Gideon appeared at Rourke's shoulder. "Walk with me," he said. They walked to the eastern pasture gate and stood there, looking out at the land. The afternoon light was long and yellow across the grass. Somewhere in the middle distance, a hawk was working a thermal. Gideon was quiet for a while. "She walked into that corral," he finally said. "Yes, I saw it from the porch." He was looking at the pasture, but Rourke had the impression he was seeing something else. "She just walked in, like she knew exactly what she was doing." She did know exactly what she was doing. Gideon was quiet again. Then the horse went to her. "He trusts her," Rourke said. "He's trusted her from the beginning. She's been the constant for him, lamp in the window. Same voice, same hands. Whatever trust that horse has built for this place, a significant part of it is because of her." Gideon put his hands on the gate. He gripped it. I've been trying to—" He stopped. Started differently. "Her mother was not suited for hard things. Claire was gentle and she was wonderful. And when she died, I thought, she left me this beautiful girl who looks just like her, and I need to—" He pressed his lips together. "I need to keep her from the hard things." Rourke said nothing. "But Maren isn't—" Gideon's voice dropped. "She's not like Clara was." "She never was. I knew that. I just kept seeing Clara when I looked at her and deciding—" He let out a long breath. "She walked into a corral with a panicked stallion, and she brought him back." "She did. Because she knew how." "Because she knew how," Rourke confirmed. Gideon stood there. The hawk made another pass. The grass moved in a low, slow wave. "I've been making decisions for her," Gideon said. "For years. Because I thought—" He stopped. "Because it was easier than asking. Easier than admitting she might want something I hadn't thought to offer." Rourke looked at the old man's face. It was the face of someone doing the hardest kind of arithmetic, the kind where the answer changes everything that came before it. "She's 30 years old," Gideon said. It came out rough at the edges. "Yes, and I've been—" He shook his head, couldn't finish it. Rourke let the silence stand. He'd found that some things only landed right if you didn't help them land, if you just stepped back and let a person arrive at a truth on their own schedule without a hand on their back. After a long moment, Gideon straightened up. He wasn't a man who showed certain kinds of things for long. "Captain Greer still wants the horse," he said. "Back to business." Rourke recognized the retreat, not coldness, just a man who needed to move to something he knew how to handle while the other thing settled. "He'll have him," Rourke said. 2 more weeks. No more incidents." "Agreed." Gideon glanced at him. "The offer he made you." "I know about the offer. It's a significant opportunity." A pause. "A man with your skills, his whole life moving from place to place." He stopped carefully. "A man might want to think about what he's building toward." Rourke looked at the pasture. "He might. That's all I'll say about it." "I appreciate that." Gideon nodded once and walked back toward the house, and Rourke stayed at the gate and thought about what the old man had said, which was less about the army offer than it appeared to be, and more about a question Gideon hadn't quite asked and wasn't sure he had the right to. By evening, the news of what Maren had done in the corral had moved through the ranch the way news moved in small places quickly and with elaboration. Pete had told someone that someone had told the cookhand. The cookhand had a long memory and a gift for a story, and by the time supper was finished, the version circulating made Midnight Crown sound like he'd been halfway through the fence when Maren got to him. Which wasn't entirely untrue. Greer found Rourke after supper. "My offer," he said. "Friday," Rourke said. "I told you Friday." "It's Wednesday. Then you have 2 more days." Greer studied him. "Something's changed your thinking." "I'm still thinking." "That's not what I mean." The captain was quiet for a moment. "Maddox, I've been placing men in positions for 12 years. I know what a man looks like when his thinking is changed, and he hasn't caught up to it yet." Rourke looked at him. "The offer is real," Greer said. "It will not come around a second time. I want you to understand that clearly." He paused. "I also want you to understand that I watched what happened at that corral today. I watched the woman walk in. I watched the horse respond." He paused again, more carefully. "And I watched you when she came out." Rourke said nothing. "Friday," Greer said, and walked away. Rourke went to the fence. Midnight Crown came to him in the dark, which he hadn't done before. He'd always been at the far end after sundown, away from everything, in the particular retreat of an animal that needed nighttime to be quiet. But tonight he came to the fence and put his nose against Rourke's shoulder and breathed there. And Rourke stood in the dark with his hand on the stallion's neck and thought about 6 months of work across 3 territories and the kind of reputation that followed a man for 20 years. He thought about the lamp in the upstairs window. He thought about a woman who had walked into a corral that everyone else had backed away from. He thought about 15 years of arriving at places and being good at the job and leaving again, and all the mornings he'd spent alone, and how many of those mornings had been fine, genuinely fine, and how they had also been completely empty of the particular kind of company he hadn't known he was missing until 5 weeks ago at a fence rail at Red Willow Ranch. Stood there for a long time. When he finally walked back to the bunkhouse, Cleet was still up, sitting with a cup of something at the small table, reading a piece of mail by lamplight. He didn't look up. "You'll figure it out," he said. "You don't know what I'm figuring. I've got a reasonable idea." Cleet turned a page. "Either way, you'll figure it out." Rourke sat on his bunk and pulled off his boots. He still had the letter in his shirt pocket. He took it out and held it for a moment, looking at the neat official handwriting, the precise numbers, the weight of what it represented a life he already knew how to live, done at a level that would satisfy him, in a direction that was clear and familiar and entirely his own. Then he set it on the bunk beside him and lay back and stared at the ceiling. And somewhere in the house across the yard, the lamp in Maren Harrow's window stayed lit until well past midnight, and Midnight Crown stood at that end of the fence in the dark and watched it. And Rourke lay in his bunk and did not sleep for a very long time. Friday came the way significant days usually did, looking exactly like any other morning until it didn't. Rourke was at the corral before sunup. He'd slept badly, which wasn't new for the last several nights, and he'd given up on it at 4:30 and dressed in the dark and gone out to where the air was cool, and the stars were still showing over the western tree line. Midnight Crown heard him coming before he reached the fence. He'd learned the sound of Rourke's particular footfall over the past weeks, which was one of those small things that accumulated into trust without anyone deciding it would, and the stallion was at the near rail when Rourke arrived. "You and me both," Rourke said. He had the letter in his jacket pocket. He'd moved it there from the bunk sometime in the night without fully remembering doing it, the way you handled things that were unresolved and wanted to keep them close until they were. He stood at the fence and didn't think about the letter. He thought about the horse. He thought about what 6 weeks had built in this animal, not obedience, not submission, but something more honest than either of those things. Midnight Crown had decided on his own schedule, and for his own reasons, that the world contained at least a few things worth trusting. That was not a small achievement for a creature that had been given strong evidence to the contrary. The eastern sky started going from black to gray. Maren appeared at the fence. Came earlier than usual, which told him she hadn't slept well either. She had a coat on over what looked like yesterday's dress, and her hair was down, which he'd only seen once before, early one morning when she hadn't expected him to be out yet. She stopped when she saw him, then came to the fence anyway. Put her hands on the rail and looked at the horse. "Today's Friday," she said. "Yes. Greer leaves this afternoon." "I know." She was quiet. Midnight Crown pushed his nose toward her, and she reached up without looking and put her hand against his jaw. It was automatic now, the way the horse came to her, not something either of them had to think about. "What are you going to tell him?" she asked. Rourke looked at the pasture. The light was coming in slowly from the east, filling in the shapes of things: fence line, tree break, the long roll of the grass. "I haven't decided." She made a sound that wasn't quite a response. He could hear her not saying something. "Say it," he said. She was quiet for another moment. "You've been at this 15 years, she said, moving from place to place. "You're good at it. You're exceptional at it. And you've built a life that fits you. A man doesn't throw that away." Because she stopped. Chose carefully, because 5 weeks at one place felt different from the others. "Different how?" "Rourke, I'm asking." She took her hand from the horse's jaw. She put both hands on the rail and looked at them. "You know how. I'd like to hear you say it." "That's not fair," she said quietly. "Probably not." She exhaled. It felt like the place and the work and the... She pressed her lips together. Like it was the right place, the right fit, like something was where it was supposed to be. She glanced at him. That's a dangerous feeling. Feelings like that make people stay in places they shouldn't stay and give up things they shouldn't give up, and mine. "Or they're right," he said. She looked at him. "Sometimes the feeling is just correct," he said. "Not every good instinct is wishful thinking." "You live by moving," she said. "You told me that. You said the leaving was easier than the staying." "I said it was easier. I didn't say it was better." Turned away from him. Back to the horse, to the habit of looking at the horse when the conversations went somewhere she hadn't prepared for. "My father is going to speak to Wesley this week about finalizing things." Date. Her voice was even, practiced even. "I think you should know that." "What do you want?" Rourke said. She closed her eyes for a moment. "What do you want?" he said again. Not pushing, just holding the question there. "What I want," she said, "has not historically been the primary consideration in the decisions that get made about my life. It is to me. The silence that followed was different from other silences. It had a quality like a held breath. Midnight Crown shifted his weight, and his hooves moved soft on the ground, and the early birds started up somewhere in the cottonwoods. Maren opened her eyes. She looked at the eastern sky. "I want to run the breeding program," she said, low and careful. "I want to work with the horses the way I know how to work with them. I want to do something real with what I know." A pause. "And I want..." She stopped. "Maren, I want to not spend the rest of my life watching other people's lives from behind a fence," she said. It came out unsteady, the first truly unsteady thing she'd said in all the weeks he'd known her. "I want to be on the right side of it, the inside." She wasn't looking at him. "That's what I want. All of it." Rourke turned toward her. He didn't touch her. He just turned, so he was facing her profile, the line of her jaw, the set of her mouth, the brightness that was still in her eyes from the night before, and from this morning, and from everything that'd been building. "Then tell your father that," he said. She made a sound. Half law, half something else. It's not that simple. It's not easy, but it's not complicated. He's all ready. "Maren." He waited until she looked at him. "Your father stood at that pasture gate 2 days ago and told me he'd been making decisions for you because it was easier than asking." Those were his words. He knows it. He's working at it. A pause. "He watched you walk into that corral. Something changed for him." She stared at him. He said that he'd been. Not in those exact words, but close enough. She looked at the horse. Something was moving through her face that he didn't want to interpret too specifically because it was private and it was hers. For a while, she said, "He's still going to push for Wesley." "Probably, for a while. And you'll be gone." Her voice went careful again. "If you take the offer." He put his hand over hers on the fence rail. She went very still. "I haven't taken it yet," he said. She looked down at his hand. She didn't move hers. "Take it or not take it, based on what's right for your life. Not based on..." She stopped. "Not based on me. What if you're part of what's right for my life?" She looked up at him. What if I've spent 15 years moving, he said, and I got to this fence and I understood for the first time what I was moving away from all along. Not toward. Away from. His voice stayed even, but he could hear the effort in it. What if this is where I'm supposed to be? Her eyes were bright, and she was doing the thing again, holding herself together with both hands on the inside, and then her jaw tightened and she said, "Don't say that to me if you don't mean it." "When have I said anything to you I didn't mean?" She looked at him for a long time. "Never," she admitted. It came out quiet. "Then hear it," he said. "I mean it." Midnight Crown put his nose between them, which was not subtle for an animal, and Maren laughed that real, brief, slightly undone laugh and pulled her hand out from under Rourke's to push the stallion's nose away gently. And the moment broke into something easier and less raw, but not less real. "Go answer the captain," she said. She was not looking at him, but the corner of her mouth was doing the almost smile. "Whatever you decide." He went. Greer was at the breakfast table, which Rourke had expected. Captain was the kind of man who was always where he said he'd be, when he said he'd be there, which was a quality Rourke respected even when it was inconvenient. Gideon was there too, which Rourke had not entirely expected, and Wesley, which he'd expected not at all. He stopped briefly in the doorway and recalibrated. "Maddox," Greer said, "sit down." Rourke sat. The cook hand put coffee in front of him. "I believe you have something to tell me," Greer said. "I do." He wrapped his hands around the cup, looked at Greer directly. "I'm going to decline the offer." The table was quiet. Greer looked at him for a long moment. His face didn't show much, it rarely did, but something behind his eyes was working. "That's a significant decision." "Yes. You understand the opportunity won't repeat." "You told me that. I believe you. And you're declining on the basis of—" Greer stopped, looked at him carefully. "On the basis of what, Maddox?" "Unfinished work," Rourke said. Greer was quiet for a moment. Then slowly he nodded once. "Not agreement. Something more like recognition." "The horse is nearly finished," he said. "I'm not talking about the horse." Greer looked at him steadily. Then he picked up his coffee cup. "The Army's loss," he said, and that was apparently all he intended to say about it, because he turned to Gideon and began discussing the purchase terms for Midnight Crown, as if the previous exchange hadn't happened. Wesley was looking at Rourke. Rourke looked back at him. Even unhurried. Wesley put down his fork. He picked it up again. He was working through something, and wasn't finding the resolution quickly, which was probably new as research for him. Purchase discussion went on around them. Numbers. Delivery timeline. The paperwork that would need to be filed. Gideon was measured and careful, which was how he handled business he'd been thinking about for a long time. Greer was precise and fair. Rourke drank his coffee and listened and thought about a woman at a fence telling him what she wanted in a voice that had cost her something to use. When the business was done and Greer pushed back from the table, he extended his hand to Rourke before he left. "If you change your mind," he said. "I won't," Rourke said. "But thank you." Greer held his grip for a moment. "She's worth it? It's not only about her?" "No. But is she worth it?" Rourke looked at him. "Yes." Greer left. Gideon sat at the table after the captain had gone, not moving. Wesley sat across from him. Rourke made to stand, and Gideon said, "Stay a moment." He sat. Gideon looked at Wesley. A long look, the kind that had a conversation in it that needed to happen, and Gideon was trying to find the start of it. Wesley met the look, and something in his posture shifted not defensively, but like a man who knows a difficult thing is coming and has decided to receive it standing. "I've been thinking," Gideon said, "about what happened at the corral 2 days ago." "I apologized for that," Wesley said. "I miscalculated the horse's readiness." "That's not what I've been thinking about." Gideon was quiet a moment. "I've been thinking about my daughter. About what she said to you when she came out of that corral." He paused. "About what she didn't say, which has been a lot, for a long time." Wesley was very still. "She's capable," Gideon said. He said it like a man practicing something, like it was a sentence he was learning the full weight of. "She is. I have watched her these past weeks, with that horse. This man." He gestured briefly at Rourke. "And I have watched myself, which is harder." His hands were flat on the table. "I have watched myself see her and not see her at the same time." See the beautiful girl I've been trying to protect, and not see the woman who doesn't need protecting. Gideon Wesley started. I'm not done, Gideon said quietly. Wesley stopped. I wanted a good life for her. I still do. A man who could provide for her. Land, stability, family, these are not small things. Wesley, your family is known to me. You're a known quantity and you're not a bad man. He held Wesley's eyes. But I've been so focused on what I was providing for her that I forgot to ask what she wanted to provide for herself. He exhaled slowly. It's my failure. It's not yours and it's not hers. It's mine. The room was very quiet. What are you saying? Wesley asked. His voice was careful. I'm saying the arrangement. Gideon stopped. Found the words. I can't push her into an arrangement she hasn't chosen. I thought I was doing right by her. I thought, he shook his head. I was doing right by my own peace of mind. That's different. Wesley sat with that for a moment. He looked at the table. Then he said, Did she tell you she didn't want it? She didn't have to tell me. That's what I'm saying. Gideon's voice dropped. A man who loves his daughter shouldn't need to be told when she's unhappy in a situation he's put her in. Wesley looked at Rourke. Something complicated on his face, not anger, not quite. More like a man trying to assess fairly what role someone else has played in his loss and not able to quite sort it cleanly. You had something to do with this, he said to Rourke. Your behavior at the corral had something to do with this, Rourke said. You got on that horse when she told you not to, Rourke said. She told you plainly. You thanked her for her concern and did what you'd already decided. That's not about the horse. That's about who you are with her. He kept his voice level. And you're probably not even aware of it. That's the part that should concern you. Wesley was quiet for a long moment. She's right that it was a pattern, he said finally. The admission came out roughly, like it cost him something real, not intentional. He stopped. I didn't think I was doing it. I know, Rourke said. That doesn't change it. No, it doesn't. Wesley looked at Gideon. I'm sorry for what I did with the horse. And he pressed his lips together, for what I apparently didn't hear when I should have been listening. Gideon nodded. Once. I know you are. Wesley stood up and picked up his hat and shook Gideon's hand with the formality of a man who needed something solid to hold on to while other things fell away. He nodded to Rourke, a short, civil nod, no warmth in it but no hostility either, and he walked out. They listened to his horse leave the yard. Gideon sat at the table and looked at his hands. Well, he said, to nobody in particular. Rourke said nothing. You turned down the army offer, Gideon said. I did. For what reason? Rourke considered how honest to be. Several. Gideon looked at him. The old man's eyes were tired but clear, the eyes of someone who'd done hard work in the last 2 days and hadn't finished but could see the shape of it now. She doesn't know what she wants to do with the rest of her life. With the horses, the breeding work, she has ideas, but they're ideas she's kept quiet for a long time because nobody asked about them. I know. You asked about them. Yes. Gideon was quiet. She's going to want things from this ranch that I haven't offered her. Yes, I can offer them. He said it plainly, the way a man spoke when he'd worked his way through something difficult and come out on the other side with a decision. The breeding program, the rehabilitation work. I've seen it in her for years, what she does with the difficult animals. I told myself it was a hobby, a phase, he exhaled. It's not a phase. She was born for it. Rourke felt something ease in him. She should have heard that from me a long time ago, Gideon said. Tell her that too. Gideon looked at him sharply. Then, slowly, he almost smiled. You're a plain-spoken man. You said something like that in our first meeting. I meant it as a compliment then, too. Rourke stood up. The horse needs work this morning, of course. Gideon stood as well. Extended his hand. Maddox, you turned down a significant opportunity. The one in front of me is better, Rourke said. He shook the hand. You'd want to stay on, permanently, if there was a reason to. The breeding program would need someone who understood the work. Training side of it. Gideon was very deliberate, very measured, like a man making sure he built the sentence right. Partner in that work. Yes, Rourke said, it would. I have land on the eastern pasture I haven't developed, Gideon said. Good land, good grass, creek access. Rourke looked at him. That's all I'll say about it. Gideon said, which was what he'd said about the army offer, except pointing in an entirely different direction. He walked out to the porch. Rourke found Maren at the fence. She was always at the fence. It had become the location where the real things between them got said, which he thought was fitting. Didn't, given that it was where he'd first seen her, and where everything had started. She turned when she heard him. She looked at his face, and whatever she read there made something change in hers. Something that had been held close and guarded loosened slightly, like a knot giving. "You turned it down," she said. "Yes." She let out a slow breath. "Why?" "Because the thing I came here for isn't the thing I'm staying for." He stopped at the fence beside her. "Close. And I've been leaving places my whole life because they didn't feel like mine. This one does." She looked at him. "The ranch?" "The ranch." "The work." He held her eyes. "You." She looked away. "Rourke, I know it's fast," he said. "I know 6 weeks is not a long time." "It's not. And I know you've had people deciding things for you, and I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not deciding anything. I'm telling you what's true for me, and I'm asking what's true for you. That's all." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her working through it, not the feeling. He thought she'd been clear about the feeling for a while. But the architecture of it, question of what happened when you wanted something you'd spent a long time believing you couldn't have. "My father will have something to say about this," she said. "Your father offered me the eastern pasture land this morning." Turned to look at him sharply. Not directly. Gideon doesn't do anything directly. But the meaning was clear. Stared at him. He ended things with Wesley. He ended the arrangement. Yes. She put both hands on the fence rail and looked at the horse for a long moment. Midnight Crown was at the near end, as he always was now, watching them with his ears forward and his enormous dark eyes, taking in the scene with what Rourke had come to think of as genuine interest. "He never asked me what I wanted," she said, soft. "Until this morning." "When did he ask this morning?" "Before breakfast. He came to my door and he asked me—" She stopped. Something moved across her face. "He asked me if I was happy. If the life he'd been building toward for me was if it was mine." She pressed her lips together. "He hasn't asked me something like that since before my mother died." Rourke waited. "I told him about the breeding program," she said. "The rehabilitation work. The ideas I've had. All of it." Her voice was still carefully managed, but the edges of it were warm, in a way that told him how much it had cost her to keep those ideas quiet for years, and what it meant to say them out loud to someone who was listening. He listened. He didn't interrupt me once. "Good." He cried a little, she said. "He'd deny it if you asked him." "I won't ask him." She almost smiled. "He told me he'd been looking at me and seeing someone who wasn't there anymore. Someone who needed protecting." Her jaw tightened slightly. "He said he was sorry. He's not a man who says that easily." "I know." She looked at Rourke, really looked the direct, unflinching look she'd given him that first morning at the fence when she'd turned to size him up and then turned away. Except this time she didn't turn away. "I've been behind that fence for 30 years, she said. Watching. Telling people things they didn't listen to. Being beautiful and useful and invisible all at the same time and trying not to be angry about it. A pause. "I don't want to step from one arrangement into another one and call it freedom." "It's fair," he said. "I want the breeding program. I want to run it myself. I want decisions about this ranch's horses to go through me." She held his eyes steadily. "That's not negotiable. Not for my father and not for—" She didn't finish the sentence. "Not for me," he said. "Yes. I wasn't going to negotiate it," he said. "I was going to help you build it." He paused. "That's what I want to stay for. The work. The horses, you doing the thing you were built to do." He held her gaze. "I spent 5 weeks watching you be right about everything that mattered, while a ranch full of people walked past you. I'd like to stop watching that happen." She searched his face, looking for the thing people said that didn't match the thing they meant. He stayed still and let her look. "You're not what I expected," she said. Which was what Gideon had said weeks ago, and he wondered if it was a family trait. "Good or bad," he said. "Good," she said. "Mostly complicated." "That's honest." "You asked for honest. I did." She looked at the horse. Midnight Crown had drifted another foot closer without appearing to do it. The way he did everything now, not cautiously, not fearfully, but with the particular deliberateness of an animal that had decided where it wanted to be and was moving there at its own pace. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "What you're talking about. I've been managing my own expectations for so long that She shook her head. "I don't entirely know what I look like when I'm not doing that." "Neither do I," he said. "We can figure it out." She looked at him. "I've been moving for 15 years, he said. "I don't know what I look like when I stay somewhere." "You don't know what you look like when you stop managing. We're both starting from somewhere close to the beginning." A pause. "That seems fair." Something broke open in her face. Not dramatically, not the way things broke in stories, all at once and clean. More like the way light came through a window when someone moved a curtain, slightly incremental, real, arriving in the room. "The eastern pasture land," she said. "Your father has good instincts when he uses them." She looked at the land in question, the long roll of it, the creek line, the place where the morning light came in first and stayed the latest in the evening. He watched her look at it, and he could see her seeing something on it that wasn't there yet, but could be the buildings, the program, the animals that would come through damaged and leave whole. "I have a lot of ideas," she said. "I know. You've been keeping them for a long time. They're not all practical. Tell me all of them," he said. "Start with the impractical ones." She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not the almost smile, not the careful practical look, not the bright-eyed intensity when she was watching the horse do something right. Something more open than any of those, something that had stopped being managed. "That might take a while," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." She turned toward the pasture, and he turned with her, and they stood at the fence that had been the first place and would become one of the significant places. And Midnight Crown came to the rail without being asked and stood with them in the morning light. And Maren began to talk about her ideas in a voice that got steadier the further she went, and Rourke listened the way he'd always listened, completely, without planning what he'd say next, and the day opened up around them unhurried, the way good days did, with no urgency and no performance and no fence between any of them and the life that was waiting on the other side. It wasn't a perfect morning. The coffee had gone cold, and Rourke's left wrist ached with the weather coming in from the north, and somewhere behind the barn, Pete was doing something loud and inexplicable with a piece of equipment. Maren's voice caught once, when she got to the part about which horses she'd start with, which type, which history, which particular kind of damage she understood best because she'd been watching it for years, and she had to stop and look at the fence rail for a moment before she continued. None of that was perfect. All of it was real, and real, Rourke had learned over a long life of arriving at places and leaving them, was the only thing that was worth staying for. The weather that came in from the north that morning brought 3 days of cold rain with it, which pushed everyone inside and made the eastern pasture look like something from a different season, entirely gray and close, and smelling of wet grass and turned earth. Rourke used the time to work on tack. It was the kind of task that occupied the hands without requiring much from the mind, which suited him because his mind was busy with other things. He sat in the barn with a saddle across the rack and a piece of leather in his hands, and thought about the conversation at the fence, and about Gideon's careful words over breakfast, and about the letter he'd folded and put in the bottom of his saddlebag that morning, not thrown away, but filed. Done. Cleet came in out of the rain on the second afternoon and shook the water off his hat and sat on a hay bale and said nothing for a while. Then heard you turn down Greer. Word gets around. Small ranch. Cleet picked up a piece of braided leather and turned it over in his hands. You're staying on then. That's the plan. Cleet nodded slowly. Not surprised. He had the quality of a man who'd watched enough of life to recognize a thing heading toward its conclusion before it got there. Gideon talked to you about the eastern pasture, in his way. He mentioned it to me, too. More directly, Cleet set down the leather. Said he was thinking about developing it. A proper setup for the breeding and rehabilitation work. He paused. Said he'd need the right people for it. What did you say? Said I thought it was the best idea he'd had in 10 years. Cleet stood up. And I've been here 19, so I've got a reasonable sample size. He put his hat back on. She's been ready for that work since she was 25. Minimum. I know it. So does he now. He moved toward the barn door. Took him a while. Better late, Rourke said. That's what I figure. Cleet went back out into the rain. The third day, the rain let up toward evening, and the sky went that particular washed color it went after a long, wet stretch, pale and clear, with the kind of light that made distances look longer than they were. Rourke walked to the corral, and Midnight Crown was at the near rail already, which was where he was most of the time now. The stallion put his nose over the fence, and Rourke stood with him in the cool air and watched the eastern pasture go gold in the last of the light. He heard Maren coming. He'd learned her footfall the way the horse had learned his. Stood beside him and looked at the same stretch of pasture. My father wants to talk to us both tomorrow morning, she said. I know, he told me. Together, at breakfast, she glanced at him. That's new. Us or the breakfast. The together part. She almost smiled. He's been different. The last 3 days. She was quiet for a moment. He asked me last night about the first horses I'd want to bring in. For the rehabilitation program, he had questions. Real ones. Not polite ones. What kind of questions? Cost. Timeline. Which contacts I had. How long a difficult horse typically needed before it was accessible for retraining. She turned toward him slightly. He'd been thinking about it on his own. He had a notebook with him. Rourke looked at her. He's never had a notebook for something I was involved in before, she said. And then, before he could respond to that, she looked back at the pasture and said, more quietly, I didn't know what to do with it. What did you do? I answered his questions. She paused. For about 2 hours. And he filled 4 pages. Her voice had something in it that she was trying to keep level and wasn't entirely managing. Not grief. Something that lived near grief, but was its opposite, the feeling you got when something you'd stopped expecting finally arrived. Kept asking follow-up questions. He wanted specifics. She stopped. Started again. He said at one point that he wished he'd had this conversation with me 5 years ago. Rourke said nothing. Some things landed better in silence. I told him 5 years ago I'd been trying to have it with him. She said it without accusation. Just as a fact that needed to be in the room. He didn't argue with that. He just said, I know. I know you were. The pasture went deeper gold. Midnight Crown breathed slowly beside them. Is that enough? Rourke asked. For you? She thought about it honestly, which was how she thought about everything. It's not everything, but it's real, and I'd rather have something real than something complete that isn't true. She looked at him. Does that make sense? Yes, he said. It does. She looked at his profile for a moment. He could feel it. You turned down something significant, she said. The Army offer. I want to make sure you understand that She stopped. Tried again. I don't want you to stay, and then Maren. And then have it be the wrong decision and Maren. Stopped. I made the decision for my own reasons, he said. You were part of them. Not all of them. He turned to look at her directly. I've been doing work I'm good at in places that didn't mean anything to me for 15 years. I'm tired of it. I want work that means something in a place that's mine. He held her eyes. This is that place. The work with you is that work. Those are my reasons. They're not going to change. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. Quietly. All right, he said. Midnight Crown pushed his nose between them again. The same move he'd been making for 2 weeks now, whenever they stood close at the fence. With the same lack of subtlety, and this time Maren laughed fully, and Rourke put his hand against the horse's jaw and pushed gently. And the stallion pulled back and shook his head and looked at them both, with what Rourke could only describe as satisfaction. He does that on purpose, Maren said. Absolutely on purpose, Rourke agreed. The breakfast the next morning was the most significant meal Rourke had eaten at Red Willow, which was saying something because he'd eaten at that table through some notable moments. Gideon sat at the head of it with his notebook, the same one Maren had mentioned, a practical brown thing with a worn cover, and he had the expression of a man who had prepared what he wanted to say and was going to say it without ceremony. I want to talk about the future of this ranch, Gideon said. Specifically the horse operation. He looked at Maren first. Then at Rourke. Then back. I've been running Red Willow for 31 years, he said. I know what I know and I know what I don't. What I don't know is what Maren knows about the horses. That's been true for a long time and I didn't treat it like a resource. That was a mistake, and I'm not going to keep making it. Maren had both hands around her coffee cup, and she was very still in the way she went still when something mattered. The eastern pasture, Gideon continued, is 80 acres of good land I've been using for overflow grazing because I didn't have a better plan for it. Maren has a better plan for it. He opened the notebook. We talked about it 2 nights ago. She has a complete program rehabilitation intake, assessment timeline, retraining protocol, breeding selection criteria. It's thorough. He looked at Maren. It's more thorough than anything I would have come up with. Maren said carefully, "It's been a long time in my head." "I know it has." He held her eyes. "That's my failure, not yours. I want you to know I understand that." She nodded once. Small and precise, the way she acknowledged things that were too large for a bigger gesture. "I want Maren to run the horse operation," Gideon said. "All of it. Breeding decisions, rehabilitation intake, training standards, purchasing, final authority." He looked at Rourke. "And I want you on the training side. Working with Maren. The pair of you are what I saw in that corral. What you managed with Midnight Crown together." He paused. "That's not something I can hire separately. That's something that exists because of how you two work." Rourke said, "You're offering permanent work." "I'm offering partnership," Gideon said. "On the eastern pasture, land included." He was very deliberate. "The details of that partnership are between you and Maren and what you two decide your life looks like. I'm not involved in that part." Maren looked at the table. Then at Rourke. Rourke looked back at her. "We'll need to build proper facilities," she said. To her father, "The eastern pasture needs a barn. Separate paddocks for intake horses. A round pen. Good water access from the creek." "I know what it needs," Gideon said. "I had Cleet sketch it out yesterday. You can look at it and tell me what's wrong with it, and we'll fix it." Something in Maren's face broke open slightly. "You had Cleet." "You've been right about the horses since you were 12 years old," Gideon said, roughly. "I should have been building this for you 10 years ago." He looked at his notebook. "I can't get 10 years back. I can build it now." The table was quiet. "Okay," Maren said. Her voice was steady, but just barely. "Okay." "Okay," Gideon said, and closed the notebook, and cleared his throat, and poured himself more coffee with the focused attention of a man who had said the hard thing and needed a moment before anything else. Cleet appeared in the doorway with the sketch actual paper, actual measurements, lines made by a man who'd been thinking about space and function and not just gesture. He spread it on the table, and Maren leaned over it immediately with the absorbed intensity of someone handling something they'd been wanting to hold for a long time. She started pointing things out within 30 seconds. Paddock placement was wrong. The intake horses needed separation from sight lines to the established herd, or the stress never dropped. The round pen was too close to the barn entrance. The water access needed a secondary line in case the creek ran low in summer. Cleet made notes. Gideon watched his daughter work through his foreman's drawing and find every problem in it with the confident precision of someone who had been right about this for years and knew it. And he watched her without the old habit of translating what he saw into something smaller. He watched her plane. Rourke watched Gideon watch her. There was a thing that happened sometimes when a person who had been looking at something the wrong way for a long time finally looked at it correctly. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and permanent, like a bone setting. Gideon's face had that quality, something that had been slightly displaced finding its right position. It was not a perfect morning. Cleet's sketch had 3 significant problems that took 40 minutes to work through. Gideon got defensive once, briefly, about the paddock placement, and Maren held firm, and there was a minute of uncomfortable silence before he said, "All right." "You're right. Change it," and Cleet changed it. Rourke's coffee went cold. Pete knocked something over outside that made everyone look up from the drawing. None of it was smooth. All of it was progress. The construction began the following week. Cleet managed it with his usual efficiency, which meant it started correctly and proceeded without drama, 2 qualities Rourke had come to associate with the man in general. Local labor came out from the nearest town, 3 men who knew what they were doing and did it without needing to be told twice, which Cleet said was because he'd worked with them before and had sent back anyone who needed to be told twice. Maren was at the eastern pasture every morning, not watching working. She knew the placement she wanted, and she communicated it, and when something didn't match what she'd planned, she said so directly and without apology, and the men listened. And Rourke noticed that this took about 4 days to become unremarkable. By the end of the first week, the crew was asking her questions before they started new sections, rather than after they'd built something wrong. He mentioned that to her one evening. They learned it was faster, she said. It's more than that. She looked at him. They respect the knowledge, he said. Once they understood you had it, they adjusted. She was quiet for a moment. My father introduced me to one of them, she said. On the second day, he said, "This is my daughter, Maren. She's running this operation." She looked at the half-built barn. "Not this is my daughter, Maren. She has some ideas about the layout. Not Maren has some thoughts you might want to consider." She turned to him. He said, "She's running this operation." "Good," Rourke said. "Such a small thing," she said, the words. "Such a small difference." "It's not small, no," she said after a moment. "I suppose it isn't." Midnight Crown went to Captain Greer on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Greer had left Red Willow. Greer had sent a man for him, a quiet, experienced horseman named Aldridge, who handled the stallion with the respectful competence of someone who'd been briefed properly. Midnight Crown loaded into the trailer with less resistance than Rourke had expected, which still surprised him, even though it shouldn't have. Maren stood in the yard when the trailer pulled out. She stood there until it was out of sight, and then she stood there a little longer. Rourke came beside her. "He's going somewhere he'll do good work," he said. "I know," she kept looking at the road. "I know he is." She pressed her lips together. "I'm not sad." "Not exactly. She shook her head. "He was the first one. The first horse that came here broken that I had the chance to mine it." "He won't be the last," Rourke said. She looked at him. "Next week," he said. "I had a letter from a man in the next county. A mare that went bad after a difficult foaling. They don't know what to do with her. Told him to bring her out." He paused. "With your approval." Stared at him. "You run the operation," he said. "I'm telling you what I know and asking if it fits what you want to start with." She blinked. "A mare, 7 years old. Good breeding lines. He says she's gone dangerous. But the description sounds more like grief and pain than danger." "Grief," Maren repeated slowly, like she was testing how the word sat alongside what she knew. "She lost the foal," Rourke said. "It's my read from the letter. He might be wrong about what he's seeing." "He's not wrong," Maren said quietly. "That's exactly what it sounds like." She looked at the road again. "Then at the half-built barn on the eastern pasture." "Yes, tell him to bring her out. Already sent the letter," Rourke said. "I just needed you to say it." The corner of her mouth moved. "You already sent it. The approval was a formality. I was sure what you'd say. You were not." "I was mostly sure." She shook her head, but the corner of her mouth had become a full smile by then. The real one, and he'd decided some time ago that it was among the finer things he'd seen. Rourke and Maren married in October, on a plain morning, with the first cold edge to the air and the cottonwoods going yellow along the creek. It was not a large event. Maren had been clear about that she wanted the people who were real to her, not a performance of an occasion. And the people who were real to her were Gideon and Cleet, and the hands who'd been at Red Willow long enough to mean something. And 2 women from the nearest town who'd been her friends since childhood and who cried, which Maren had apparently predicted and warned Rourke about in advance. Rourke had nobody to invite, which she told her without any particular weight, and she'd looked at him for a moment and then said, "Cleet's known you 6 weeks and he'd take a fence post for you. I think that counts," which was both accurate and one of the better things anyone had said to him in recent memory. It was a short ceremony, no performance. Gideon shook Rourke's hand afterward for a long time without saying much, which was the most Gideon thing Gideon had ever done. Cleet said, "About time," to nobody in particular, which was also accurate. They moved into the eastern pasture house in November, when the barn was finished and the first paddocks were ready, and the mare whose name was Birch. Though she'd stopped answering to it when she arrived and had to be reintroduced to her own name, like a person finding themselves again, had been there 3 weeks, and was beginning to eat without being coaxed. The house was not finished when they moved in. There was no kitchen in the south end yet, and one of the windows in the bedroom didn't shut entirely right, and there was a leak in the roof corner that Cleet swore he'd get to before the serious winter came. None of that mattered in the way it would have mattered to someone who'd been waiting for perfect before they began. Maren had been waiting long enough. Rourke had been moving long enough. They moved in on a Tuesday with the window that didn't shut right, and the roof that needed attention, and a kitchen that was framing in air, and they ate supper at a table that had one uneven leg, and it was theirs. That was the part that mattered. The breeding program ran its first full season the following spring. It was not a clean season. 3 of the rehabilitation horses came in worse than their owners had represented, which meant the timeline stretched, and the costs ran over what Maren had projected. And there was a week in March where she worked 18-hour days and came to bed with her hands rough from the cold and fell asleep before she could finish a sentence. There was also the stallion they almost lost in April, a gray animal named Porter that another rancher had written off entirely, who turned out to have a deep abscess in his right foot that nobody had found because nobody had looked carefully enough. And the infection had gone far enough that the first veterinarian who came out said the kindest thing might be to let him go. Maren said no. She stood in that paddock and said no, in the flat, certain voice she used when she was completely sure and would not be moved. And she and Rourke worked with the second veterinarian they brought in over 2 weeks that required more patience and more sleeplessness than either of them had calculated. Porter walked out of that paddock on his own 4 feet in May. He wasn't sound enough for hard work. He'd never be. But he walked out, and he stood in the spring grass of the eastern pasture with his nose into the light, and Maren put her hand on his neck and Rourke stood beside her. And neither of them said anything because there wasn't anything to say that was larger than what they were looking at. That was the season that ranchers in the territory started talking about the program at Red Willow's eastern pasture. Not all of them, not right away. The ones who needed easy solutions went elsewhere, men who wanted fast results and didn't like being told that fast results on a frightened or damaged horse were usually just new damage with a different face. But the ones who'd run out of options, who'd tried everything the standard way and found themselves with an animal they didn't know what to do with, those men started appearing at the eastern pasture gate and asking if Maren Harrow had time to look at what they'd brought. She usually did. Rourke watched her work through that season with the focus of a man cataloging something important. He knew what he'd seen in her from the beginning, the knowledge, the patience, the particular quality of attention she brought to an animal that had stopped trusting people. But knowing a thing and watching it operate at full scale over a full season were different experiences. She made mistakes. She miscalculated 2 horses' readiness and had to extend their program significantly. She was wrong, once, about a stallion she'd assessed as fear-based and turned out to be genuinely unpredictable. And Rourke was the one who figured it out and told her, and she took it and adjusted without defensiveness and changed her assessment. And then she went back and worked out where she'd missed it and told him exactly what she'd failed to see and why, which was the marks of someone serious about the work rather than about being right. She was almost always right. But the times she wasn't were the times that showed him who she was most clearly, a person who cared more about the horses than about her own correctness, which was rarer than it sounded. Gideon came to the eastern pasture most days. Not to oversee, he'd been clear about that, and he held to it even when it was visibly hard for him, which it sometimes was, because he was a man who'd run his own operation for 30 years, and stepping back from daily decisions was not natural to him. He came because he wanted to be there, because he'd spent 10 years not knowing what was happening in this part of his daughter's life, and he was making up for lost ground. He and Rourke had a habit of standing at the eastern fence in the late afternoon, watching the horses move in the paddocks, talking about nothing that required much effort, the weather, state of the north pasture grass, a piece of equipment that needed replacing. Kind of talk that wasn't really about itself. The kind that meant, I'm here. This is good. We got here eventually. One afternoon in late summer, Gideon said, out of nowhere, I introduced her to a man at the Hendersons' supper last spring, before you came. Fellow from over the Callaway way, decent enough man, good land. He was looking at the paddocks. I spent the whole supper thinking about how I was going to suggest it to her. Rourke said nothing. She spent the whole supper talking to Henderson's old aunt about a technique the woman's father had used on draft horses 50 years ago. He shook his head. She got more out of that conversation than I got out of 10 years of trying to arrange her life. She usually does, Rourke said. I know it now. Gideon was quiet for a moment. I knew it then too, somewhere. He stopped. Kept thinking I knew better, because I loved her. Loving someone doesn't always mean knowing what they need. No, he exhaled. It doesn't. They stood there for a while. She's happy, Gideon said. It came out like an answer to a question he'd been sitting with. Yes, Rourke said. She was not happy before. Not really. He pressed his lips together briefly. She was contained. She was managing. She was careful. He looked at the paddocks, where Maren was working with a young roan that had come in 3 weeks prior, her movements unhurried and precise. The horse watching her with the beginning of the kind of attention that meant trust was starting to build. She is not managing now. No, Rourke said, she isn't. Gideon turned and looked at him directly. You stayed, he said. Yes. You turned down a significant thing to stay. I turned it down for better things, Rourke said. I'm clear on that. Gideon nodded, looked back at his daughter. So am I, he said. By the following spring, Maren was carrying their first child, which she told Rourke on a Thursday morning at the eastern pasture fence, because that was where they told each other the significant things. She said it plainly and watched his face, and what she saw there made her laugh, because it was not a complicated face. In that moment, it was the face of a man entirely overtaken by something he hadn't known how much he wanted until it arrived. He put both arms around her, and she let him, which she sometimes did and sometimes didn't, depending on the day, and whether she decided she was in the mood to be held, which was her right, and a thing he'd learned and respected. I'm not going to be good at all of it, she said into his shoulder. Nobody is. I mean it. I don't know how she stopped. I don't want to do what my father did. See the child in front of me and not see who they actually are. You'll see them, he said. You see everything. Not everything. More than most. She pulled back and looked at him. Her eyes were steady and serious, and also underneath the serious bright with something she was still getting used to feeling without apology. We're going to be tired, she said, for a long time. And the program can't stop. The horses don't Maren. He held her face in his hands. We'll figure it out. She looked at him. We've figured out harder things than a new person, he said. She almost argued with that. He could see her almost do it. Then she looked at the pasture and the paddocks and the half-dozen horses that had come to them broken and were leaving whole, and she let out a long breath and leaned her forehead against his, and he closed his eyes. All right, she said. We'll figure it out. There was a morning the following autumn after the baby had arrived, and the program had expanded, and the eastern pasture had become the thing Maren had always seen on it when it was still just grass and a fence when. Rourke came to the rail and found her there before him. She was leaning on the fence where she'd always leaned. Hair loose against her collar, one boot on the bottom rail, her attention on the paddock where Midnight Crown had stood and paced and terrified himself in those early days when Red Willow was still a place Rourke was just passing through. Paddock was full of different horses now. A bay mare that had come in last month, head shy and shaking. A young gelding with damage in his past that showed up as a kind of anxious, perpetual readiness, like he was always waiting for the next bad thing. 2 animals in the far paddock that were weeks away from leaving, sound and settled, ready for the lives that had been waiting for them once someone took the time to find out what was wrong. Maren watched them the way she'd always watched them. The whole of her attention. Nothing held back. Rourke came and stood beside her. She didn't look at him. She said, "The bay mare let me touch her left ear yesterday." "That's the first time." "Yes." He leaned on the fence. "What did you do there?" "Kept my hand still." She paused. She decided. He looked at the mare, then at Maren's profile. He thought about the first morning. The woman at the fence who hadn't turned to look at him when she knew he was there, giving him information about a horse, precise and immediate, and without any expectation that he'd use it the way she hoped. The woman who'd spent 30 years being seen for the wrong things by people who loved her. who'd kept an enormous amount of herself very quiet for a very long time because quiet was what the situation required. She was not quiet now, not in the way that mattered. She argued with the veterinarians when she was right, and acknowledged it clearly when she was wrong, and told her father what she needed from him, and told Rourke what she needed from him, which were different things, and she knew the difference. She ran the program the way she'd always known how to run it, with patience and specificity, and the willingness to sit in the hard part of a problem until the problem showed you where it lived. She had stopped watching from the other side of the fence. He thought about Midnight Crow, the horse he'd come for, the horse that had been the whole point of Red Willow in the beginning, which now felt like the beginning of a different story than the one he'd thought he was arriving for. The stallion was somewhere in the territory, doing the work Greer had known he was built for, carrying soldiers with the steady power of an animal that had found its purpose after a long detour through fear. Rourke hoped he was all right. He thought he probably was. He thought that the capacity for trust, once genuinely built, didn't tend to disappear when the context changed. He thought the same was true for people. He thought about 15 years of moving. All the ranches, all the difficult horses, all the mornings he'd stood at fences in places that didn't belong to him and done good work and left. He'd told himself for a long time that the leaving was freedom. He understood now that freedom and belonging were not opposites. That a man could choose a place and still be free. That choosing, in fact, was the freest thing, not drifting, not leaving before you were left, not keeping yourself at the near edge of every situation so the exit was always close. Staying was the harder thing. Staying was also the true thing. He'd learned that from a horse, more or less, or from the woman who'd understood the horse before anyone else did. He was still working out which. Maybe it didn't matter which. Going to be all right, Maren said. The bay mare. She just needs to understand that the ear is hers. That nobody's going to take it from her without permission. She watched the mare move across the paddock. Once she understands that, she'll stop defending it. How long? Rourke asked. However long it takes. He nodded. From the house, a sound small and distant, the sound of a child waking. Maren heard it, and her whole posture shifted, the particular reorientation of a person who has built a new center of gravity and moves toward it automatically. I'll go, Rourke said. She looked at him. Something in her eyes, the warmth that had always been there, underneath the careful management that he'd had the good luck and the stubbornness to wait for. You don't have to. I know I don't. He pushed off the fence and walked toward the house. Behind him, he heard Maren turn back to the paddock and say something low and unhurried to the bay mare, words that didn't matter, just a voice that did, and the horse, from where he could still see it, raised its head and turned toward the sound. That was the thing about trust. It didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive complete and certain. It built in the small repeated moments the lamp left on, the hand held steady, the person who showed up at the fence the same way every morning until showing up was its own kind of promise. People thought it was about bravery. They thought it was about the dramatic moment, the corral, the panicked horse, the woman walking in when everyone else backed away. And those moments mattered. They did. But what made them possible was everything that came before them. All the mornings, all the small kept promises, all the times a person decided to be present when absence would have been easier. That was what Rourke had learned at Red Willow Ranch. Not from the horse, not even from Maren exactly. From what happened when two people decided, separately and then together, to stop managing their lives from a safe distance and step into them instead. It was not a perfect life. The roof still leaked in one corner when the rain came from the northeast, and Rourke's wrist ached every time the weather changed. And Maren was wrong about horses sometimes, and about people more often than she'd admit. And Gideon had days where the old habits surfaced, and he started deciding things he'd promised himself he'd stop deciding. And Clet had to remind him gently, which Clet did with the patience of a man who'd been doing it for 19 years and had another good stretch in him. None of that was perfect. All of it was theirs. And some mornings, most mornings, if he was honest. Rourke stood at the eastern pasture fence in the early light and thought about a famous horsebreaker who had ridden into a ranch for a horse and been stopped in his tracks by a woman at a fence who hadn't even turned to look at him. Come for Midnight Crown. He'd stayed for everything else. And everything else, it turned out, was the point.